The sun hung low over Redemption Creek, casting long shadows across the dusty main street. Matthew Cole stood in the shadows of the saloon's awning, watching the crowd gather in the town square. His weathered face remained expressionless, but his eyes, hard and cold as the Colorado winter, missed nothing. At 45, the former Texas Ranger and disgraced sheriff carried his years in the lines etched deep around his eyes and the silver threads running through his dark hair. The gallows stood ready, its fresh pine boards gleaming obscenely bright against the dull browns and grays of the town. A crude structure, hastily assembled, but it would serve its purpose. It always did. "They're hanging another one," said a voice beside him. Sam Wilson, owner of the Wayfarer Saloon and one of the few men in Redemption Creek who still spoke to Matthew Cole. Sam was pushing 60, with rheumy eyes and hands that trembled slightly from too many years of cheap whiskey. "Apache," Matthew replied, his voice a graveled whisper from disuse. "Name's Two Hawks." "You know him?" Matthew's jaw tightened. "No, he's innocent." The crowd's murmur rose as Sheriff Jenkins led the prisoner from the jailhouse. Two Hawks walked with dignity despite the shackles, his face impassive. He wasn't young, maybe 50, with deep lines carved into copper skin and long gray hair that had been cut unevenly. A final humiliation. "Heard he killed a prospector," Sam ventured. "Prospector was killed with a Colt 45, Matthew said flatly. Two Hawks never touched a white man's gun in his life. Wouldn't. Matter of pride." The new sheriff, Jenkins, once Matthew's deputy, strutted beside the prisoner, chest puffed out beneath his shining star. Behind him walked Robert Sullivan, owner of the silver mines and the man who'd bought and paid for everything in Redemption Creek, including the sheriff's badge and the judge's gavel. Sullivan was 53, expensively dressed in a black suit that marked him as different from the dusty miners and merchants. His face was handsome in a hard way, with cold eyes that calculated everything in terms of profit and loss. He walked with the confidence of a man who knew the world bent to his will. "Robert Sullivan," Matthew muttered, the name like poison on his tongue. "Always there to watch his handiwork." "Best not let him hear you," Sam warned. "Man's got a long memory for enemies." Matthew said nothing, but his hand unconsciously moved to his side where a gun should have been. 5 years since he'd worn a weapon. 5 years since he'd stood against another Sullivan-ordered hanging and lost everything. His badge, his reputation, and later in the cruel fever that swept through town, his wife Sarah and 8-year-old son William. No doctor would come to the home of the Injun lover, as they'd taken to calling him. By the time he'd ridden 40 miles to the next town for help, it was too late. He'd buried them on the hill behind his cabin, carved their names in stone, and locked away what remained of his heart. The drums began, a somber beat as Two Hawks climbed the 13 steps. Matthew watched, his face a mask, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the saloon post. "You still think about taking that badge back?" Sam asked quietly. Matthew's eyes never left the gallows. "Badge is just tin, Sam. Doesn't make justice. You made it mean something once. Ancient history." Sheriff Jenkins read the charges, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet square. Murder, theft, trespassing on company land. The usual lies when Sullivan wanted Indian land cleared. Two Hawks stood tall as the noose was fitted around his neck. "Any last words?" Jenkins asked, going through the motions of civilization. Two Hawks looked out over the crowd, his gaze sweeping past until it found Matthew in the shadows. Recognition flickered. In the condemned man spoke in Apache, words meant for one man alone. "Remember the promise, Shadow Wolf. The last of my people will need the man who once lived among us." Matthew felt the words like a physical blow. Shadow Wolf, a name from another life, when he'd lived with the Apache after being wounded in a Comanche raid. They'd saved him, made him one of their own for a time, a debt he'd failed to repay. Sheriff Jenkins slapped Two Hawks hard across the face. "English or nothing, savage!" The trapdoor opened with a sickening crack. Matthew turned away, pushing through the bat-winged doors into the dim sanctuary of the saloon. Behind him, the crowd's cheer rose like the howl of wolves. Inside, Sam followed, pouring 2 whiskeys without being asked. The saloon was empty. Everyone was outside enjoying the spectacle. "You understood what he said," Sam observed, sliding a glass across the scarred oak bar. Matthew downed the whiskey in one swallow, feeling it burn all the way down. He called me by my Apache name. Didn't know you had one. Long time ago. Matthew's eyes had the distant look of a man seeing ghosts. I was with the Rangers. Got shot up in a Comanche raid. Left for dead. White Mountain Apache found me. Took me in. Spent almost a year with them while I healed. Never knew that part of your story, Sam said, refilling the glass. Not something I advertise. Matthew stared into the amber liquid. Two Hawks was their war chief then. He taught me their ways, their language. And now he's swinging from a rope. Sam shook his head. What was that promise he mentioned? Matthew's face hardened. Nothing that matters anymore. But it did matter. The promise had been made 15 years ago when Matthew finally returned to the white man's world. A pledge to help the White Mountain people if they ever needed him. A debt of honor he'd tried to pay 5 years ago when he'd stood against another hanging and failed. Sullivan's finishing what he started, Matthew said quietly, wiping out the last of the White Mountain Apache. There's a new silver vein found on their hunting grounds. Thought most of them were killed in that Comanche raid 10 years back. Matthew's eyes flashed. Wasn't Comanche. That was Sullivan's men, dressed up with war paint. I tried to prove it when I was sheriff. His laugh was bitter. That's when I lost the badge. The saloon doors swung open, letting in harsh sunlight and the sound of the still celebrating crowd. 3 men entered, Sullivan's hired guns by the look of them. Hard men with cold eyes and well-used revolvers hanging low on their hips. The leader, a man with a face crossed by a knife scar, spotted Matthew and nudged his companions. Well, look who it is, the Injun sheriff himself. Matthew didn't turn. Saloon's closed, Reese. Scarface Reese laughed. Public establishment, ain't it, Sam? We got money to spend. Sam nervously wiped the bar. Don't want any trouble. No trouble, Reese said, his eyes never leaving Matthew's back. Just celebrating justice being done. Another savage sent to hell. Matthew's shoulders tightened, but he kept his gaze on his glass. Heard you was tight-witted that Apache scum, Reese continued, moving closer. Maybe you understand their devil language. What did he say before he danced on air? Matthew finally turned, meeting Reese's gaze with eyes gone flat and dangerous. He said there's no mercy for men who hang innocents. Reese's hand drifted toward his gun. Sounds like treason talk to me. The tension stretched between them. A wire pulled taut. Sam's hand moved beneath the bar where he kept a shotgun. The moment broke when a commotion erupted outside. Shouts and the sound of horses at a gallop. Reese glanced toward the door, momentarily distracted. Saved by the bell, he sneered, backing toward the door. We'll finish this conversation another time, Cole. After they left, Sam exhaled shakily. Jesus, Matt, you trying to get yourself killed? Matthew returned to his whiskey. Been dead 5 years already. The noise outside grew louder. Matthew moved to the window, pulling back the grime-streaked curtain. A group of riders had entered town, dragging someone behind them. What now? Sam asked, joining him at the window. Matthew's eyes narrowed as he made out the form being pulled through the dust. A woman, her hands bound, stumbling to keep up with the horses. Apache by the look of her traditional dress, now torn and dirt-streaked. Young, perhaps 25, with the proud bearing of her people despite her predicament. Sullivan's men, Matthew said, recognizing the leader. Bill Harker, Sullivan's head of security. They've caught themselves another spy. Spy? Sam echoed. Sullivan's favorite excuse when he wants someone dead. Claim they're Apache spies coordinating attacks on the railroad or the mine. Matthew's voice was tight. There hasn't been an Apache raid in these parts for 8 years. The woman stumbled and fell. One of the riders dismounted and roughly yanked her to her feet. Even from a distance, Matthew could see the bruises on her face, the defiance in her eyes as she glared at her captors. They're not taking her to the jail, Matthew observed as the riders turned away from the main street. Sam frowned. Where then? North Trail, into the foothills. Matthew's face darkened. They don't want witnesses for what comes next. Matt, Sam's voice held warning, don't get involved. Not your fight anymore. Matthew watched as the woman was jerked forward again. She raised her head, and for an instant, her gaze seemed to find his through the window. In her eyes, he saw not fear, but the same quiet dignity he'd seen in Two Hawks. The same dignity he'd seen in Sarah's eyes as she'd slipped away, her hand clutching his while fever burned through her. Something long dormant stirred in Matthew's chest. "They're not taking her to jail," he repeated, his voice hardening. "They won't give her even the mockery of a trial Two Hawks got." "What are you going to do?" Sam asked, though he already knew the answer. Matthew turned from the window, his decision made. "I need my rifle." "It's been 5 years since you fired a gun," Sam reminded him. A grim smile touched Matthew's lips. "Some things you don't forget." Sam disappeared into the back room, returning with a cloth-wrapped bundle. "Kept it oiled," he said, placing it on the bar. Matthew unwrapped the Winchester rifle with reverent hands. The weapon felt both familiar and strange, like greeting an old friend who had changed in one's absence. "There's a horse out back you can use," Sam said. "Old gelding, but he's steady." Matthew nodded his thanks, checking the rifle's action. It moved smoothly, ready for work. He looked up at Sam, his eyes hard with purpose. "If I don't come back—" "I know," Sam cut him off. "I'll see to it that your place is looked after." Outside, the riders with their prisoner had disappeared around the bend, heading into the foothills where the pine forest thickened, where a body could be hidden and never found. Matthew slung the rifle over his shoulder and headed for the back door. "Matt," Sam called after him, "you sure about this? You're risking everything." Matthew paused, one hand on the doorframe. "What's everything, Sam? I lost it all already." He stepped outside into the harsh sunlight, feeling the weight of the rifle across his back. 5 years since he'd worn a gun, since he'd stood against injustice. 5 years of hiding in the shadows, nursing his grief and guilt. Two Hawk's final words echoed in his mind. "The last of my people will need the man who once lived among us." Perhaps this was his chance to finally keep that promise. The trail was easy to follow. Sullivan's men made no effort to hide their tracks, confident in their power and the town's indifference. Matthew rode at a steady pace, staying just far enough behind to avoid detection. The old gelding wasn't built for speed, but he was sure-footed on the rocky trail that wound up into the foothills. Matthew's body remembered the rhythm of tracking, the watchfulness, the patience. Skills learned as a ranger, honed during his year with the Apache. He'd been a different man then, younger, idealistic, believing in justice. Before Sullivan, before failure, before graves dug on a lonely hillside. The trail climbed higher, pine forest closing in on either side. Perfect ambush country. Matthew dismounted, securing the gelding to a fallen log, and continued on foot. The Winchester felt natural in his hands, an extension of his will. Voices drifted down from above, rough laughter, the sound of men who answered to no law but their own appetites. Matthew moved silently through the trees, placing each foot with care as Two Hawks had taught him. Shadow Wolf, they'd called him, for his ability to move unseen. He came to the edge of a clearing and crouched behind a stand of pines. 4 men and the Apache woman stood at the edge of a steep ravine. Bill Harker, Sullivan's head of security, grabbed the woman's face, forcing her to look at him. "Last chance, squaw," he growled. "Tell us about the Apache war party. Where are they gathering? How many?" The woman spat in his face. "There is no war party. White eyes. My people are shattered. Hunted. You know this." Harker wiped the spittle from his cheek, his face darkening. "Wrong answer." He nodded to the other men. "Throw her over. Make it look like an accident." 2 men grabbed the woman's arms. She struggled, but with her hands bound, she was no match for their strength. They dragged her toward the edge of the ravine. Matthew raised the Winchester, steadying it against a pine trunk. He drew a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report shattered the mountain silence. One of the men holding the woman jerked backward, a red stain blossoming on his chest. He collapsed without a sound. The remaining men froze, then scattered for cover, dragging the woman with them. Harker drew his revolver, scanning the trees. "Shoot her on the ridge," he shouted. "Johnson, circle left. Evans, right." Matthew shifted position, moving quickly through the underbrush. He'd lost the element of surprise, but gained confusion. The men wouldn't know if they faced one attacker or many. He found a new vantage point and settled in, searching for targets. One of the men, Johnson, was creeping along the tree line, revolver drawn. Matthew lined up the shot and fired. Johnson stumbled, clutching his shoulder, then ran crashing through the brush in panicked retreat. From his position, Matthew could see the Apache woman. She had managed to roll beneath a fallen log for protection. Her eyes scanned the forest, alert and calculating despite her predicament. A shot rang out, the bullet splintering bark inches from Matthew's head. Evans had spotted him. Matthew ducked and rolled, coming up behind a boulder as more shots kicked up dirt around him. "It's Cole!" Harker's voice carried across the clearing. "The ex-sheriff. Sullivan will pay double for his head." Matthew moved again, circling toward where he'd last seen the woman. He needed to reach her before Harker used her as a hostage, or worse, completed his original plan. Evans appeared suddenly between the trees, firing wildly. Matthew dropped to one knee, took aim, and fired. The man collapsed, his gun discharging harmlessly into the dirt. Silence fell over the clearing. Matthew advanced cautiously, rifle ready. He found Harker lying behind a fallen tree, blood pooling beneath him from a wound in his side. "Should have stayed out of it, Cole," Harker gasped, his face gray with pain. "Sullivan will hunt you down for this." "He can try," Matthew replied, kicking Harker's revolver away. "Where's the woman?" Harker's laugh turned into a cough. "Doesn't matter. She's dead anyway. We're all dead men walking in Sullivan's world." A twig snapped behind Matthew. He turned, rifle raised, to find the Apache woman standing there. She had freed her hands somehow and held a bloody knife, likely taken from one of the fallen men. They regarded each other warily. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps early 20s, with intelligent eyes that assessed him as carefully as he studied her. Despite the dirt and bruises, there was a striking beauty to her. High cheekbones, proud bearing, and eyes that held both wariness and fierce determination. "You speak the tongue of the White Mountain people?" she asked in Apache. Matthew nodded. "I lived among your people once. They called me Shadow Wolf." Recognition flickered in her eyes. "The ranger who became a brother. My father spoke of you." "Your father?" "Chief Black Elk." Matthew felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Black Elk had been the tribe's leader, a wise and formidable man. "Black Elk is dead, killed in the massacre 10 years ago." Pain flashed across her face. "Yes, I am Nayeli, his daughter. I was away when the attack came. I returned to find my people slaughtered." Matthew lowered his rifle. Chief Black Elk's daughter, the man who had saved his life, made him a blood brother of the tribe. The debt he owed had just grown heavier. "You need to leave this territory," he said, switching to English. "Sullivan's men will be looking for both of us now." She lifted her chin. "I will not run. I came to find the man who ordered my people killed." "Sullivan," tied him, Matthew said, the name bitter on his tongue. "You won't get near him. He's too well protected." "I was close," she countered. "I worked in his house as a servant, using another name. I was searching for proof of his crimes when they discovered me." Matthew stared at her, reassessing. She was either incredibly brave or foolhardy, perhaps both. "What did you find?" "Nothing yet." Her expression hardened. "But I will. Justice must be done." A groan from Harker reminded them they weren't alone. The wounded man was trying to reach inside his jacket with his good arm. Matthew crossed to him in 2 strides, yanking his hand away. From inside Harker's jacket, he removed not a weapon, but a folded document. "What's this?" Harker's smile was bloody. "Insurance, in case Sullivan decided I was expendable." Matthew unfolded the paper. It was a letter written in a cramped hand detailing orders for the massacre of the White Mountain Apache 10 years earlier. It was signed by Sullivan's then second-in-command, who had committed suicide a year after the attack. "Why carry this?" Matthew demanded. "Leverage," Harker gasped. "Sullivan's building an empire. Can't have old sins coming to light." His eyes flickered to Nellie. That's why she had to die. Last of the White Mountain Chief's line. Last witness. Nellie moved forward, knife raised, but Matthew caught her wrist. "Not like this," he said in Apache. "It makes you like them." Her eyes blazed, but after a moment she lowered the knife. "What then? We let him live to hunt us?" Matthew considered Harker, who was rapidly weakening from blood loss. "He won't make it down the mountain without help, and will be long gone by the time any help arrives." He pocketed the letter, then turned to Nellie. "We need to move, now. Sullivan will send men when these don't return." She studied him, still uncertain. "Why did you help me, Shadow Wolf? Why break your long silence?" Matthew had no easy answer. Was it Two Hawk's final request? The debt he owed Black Elk? Or something else? A spark of the man he'd once been, not yet fully extinguished? Let's just say I'm tired of watching innocent people die, he finally replied. A gunshot cracked through the trees. Matthew staggered, feeling a burning pain tear through his side. He spun, raising the Winchester one-handed, and fired at the movement among the pines. The remaining gunman, the one he thought had fled, fell face first into the clearing, his revolver still clutched in his hand. Matthew pressed his hand to his side, feeling warm wetness seep between his fingers. Not fatal, but bad enough. The bullet had torn through the flesh above his hip. "You're hit," Neely said, moving to his side. "It's nothing," he lied, the world already starting to tilt around him. She tore a strip from her dress and pressed it against the wound. "You will not die, Shadow Wolf. Not after finding me." His vision blurred as blood loss and shock took their toll. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Nellie's face, set with determination, outlined against the vast Colorado sky. The hunt had only just begun. Matthew awoke to pain and the scent of pine smoke. His side throbbed with every heartbeat, the wound a fiery line across his ribs. He blinked, his vision swimming into focus as he took in unfamiliar surroundings. Rough stone walls, a small fire, shadows dancing across a low ceiling. A cave. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, falling back with a hiss of pain. "Be still," came a voice from the shadows. "The bullet passed through clean, but you lost much blood." Nieli emerged into the firelight. She had cleaned the dirt from her face and bound her long black hair back with a strip of leather. In her hands, she carried a wooden cup filled with a steaming liquid that smelled bitter and earthy. "Where are we, Matthew managed, his throat dry as creek sand in August. 5 miles east of where you fell," she replied, kneeling beside him. "The mountains here are honeycombed with caves. My people used them as hiding places when the soldiers came." She slipped an arm behind his shoulders, helping him raise his head enough to drink. The liquid was as bitter as it smelled, a tea made from pine bark and herbs he recognized from his time with the Apache, medicine to fight fever and infection. "Sullivan's men?" he asked when she lowered him back. "No sign yet, but they will come." She moved to tend the fire, adding small branches that caught quickly. "The storm has helped us." For the first time, Matthew registered the sound of rain pattering against stone outside the cave entrance. A spring storm had swept in, obscuring their trail and keeping pursuers at bay. For now. "How long was I out?" "Since yesterday." She stirred something in a small pot nestled in the coals. "I bound your wound, dragged you here before dark. You are heavier than you look, Shadow Wolf." Despite the pain, Matthew felt a ghost of a smile touch his lips. "Matthew," he said. "My name is Matthew Cole." She nodded. "I know this name. The sheriff who stood against Sullivan." Her dark eyes studied him in the firelight. "The man who tried to bring justice for my people." "And failed," he added grimly. "Yet here you are," she countered, "bleeding for justice again." Matthew closed his eyes, exhaustion pulling at him. The years of isolation, of nursing his grief in solitude, had left him ill-prepared for this, for caring again, for fighting, for the weight of another's expectations. "I'm not that man anymore," he said quietly. "That man died with his family." Nieli was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice held an edge of steel. "My father taught that the spirit cannot die unless we surrender it. Have you surrendered yours, Shadow Wolf?" Before he could answer, a sound came from outside, the distant whinny of a horse, barely audible over the rain. Nieli moved swiftly to the cave entrance, peering out through the curtain of water. "Riders," she whispered, "3 of them, moving along the ridge." Matthew struggled to sit up, ignoring the fire in his side. "Help me up." She returned to his side, slipping a strong arm around his shoulders. With her support, he managed to reach a sitting position, leaning back against the cave wall. His head swam with the effort, but he forced himself to focus. "My rifle? Here." She retrieved the Winchester from where it rested against the wall, checking its action with practiced hands. 6 shots remaining. Matthew raised an eyebrow. "You know firearms." "I have lived in your world for 10 years, she replied. "I learned what I needed to survive." She handed him the weapon. "Can you shoot?" He tested his grip, trying to steady his shaking hands. If they get close enough. She nodded, then returned to the cave entrance. Rain had intensified, turning the forest outside into a gray blur. The riders had disappeared from view, but both knew they were out there searching. "We cannot stay here," Neely said. "This cave is known to trackers." "I can't move far," Matthew admitted. "Not yet." She turned back to him. Decision made. Rest. Regain strength. "I will lead them away from here." "No," Matthew's voice was sharp. "Too dangerous." "I have survived 10 years alone," she reminded him. "I know these mountains better than Sullivan's men." "And if they catch you?" A humorless smile touched her lips. "Then you avenge me, as I would avenge you." Before he could protest further, she gathered a small pack she'd fashioned from Harker's saddlebags, filling it with pine bark and the herbs she'd collected. "There is food here," she said, pointing to the pot by the fire. "Rabbit I snared this morning. Eat to regain strength." She pulled a revolver from her waistband. Harker's gun, Matthew realized. "I have this, and a knife." "Nieli," he began. "I will return by nightfall," she cut him off. "If I do not—" She left the sentence unfinished, but her eyes held his, a silent understanding passing between them. Then she was gone, a shadow melting into the rain-soaked forest. Matthew leaned his head back against the cold stone, clutching the Winchester across his lap. Lone again, with the ghosts of his failures. Sarah's face swam before him, as it did in his dreams, her eyes reproachful, asking why he had survived when she and William had not. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the empty cave. "I couldn't save you." Outside, the storm raged on, carrying away his words like smoke in the wind. The rain stopped by midday, sunlight filtering through the pine branches in golden shafts. Matthew had managed to eat some of the rabbit stew, forcing himself to swallow despite his lack of appetite. The food and medicine had strengthened him enough to check his wound. A clean hole through the flesh above his hip, painful but not mortal if infection could be kept at bay. He dressed it as best he could with strips torn from his shirt, wincing as he pulled the bandage tight. Now he waited, listening to the forest sounds returning as the storm receded. Bird song, the drip of water from leaves, the occasional scurry of small creatures. No sign of Nellie or Sullivan's men. His thoughts turned to the document he'd taken from Harker, now carefully folded in his inside pocket. Proof of Sullivan's involvement in the massacre of the White Mountain Apache. Not legally binding, perhaps, it was written by a dead man, but enough to raise questions, to spark an investigation if it reached the right hands. The territorial governor was an honest man, from what Matthew had heard. A former judge with no love for men like Sullivan who twisted the law to their own ends. If the document could reach Denver. But Denver was 100 miles away, across terrain controlled by Sullivan's interests. And Matthew was in no condition to make such a journey, not with a bullet wound and Sullivan's men hunting him. His musings were interrupted by the sound of a branch snapping outside. Matthew froze, rifle instantly raised toward the cave entrance, finger tightening on the trigger. A shadow appeared at the mouth of the cave. "It's me," came Nellie's voice. Matthew lowered the rifle, relief washing through him. "Any sign of pursuit?" She entered, shaking water from her hair. She'd been swimming, her clothes were soaked, but her eyes were bright with triumph. "They followed my trail north, toward the old mining camp," she said, kneeling by the fire to warm herself. "I led them in circles, then doubled back through the creek." "Smart," Matthew nodded. "Water leaves no trail. I learned from the best trackers of my people." She reached into her pack, pulling out a handful of fresh herbs. "I found more medicine plants, and these." She opened her other hand to reveal 3 bullets, Winchester rounds, matching his rifle. "Where did you get those?" he asked, surprised. "From a dead man." She set about crushing the herbs with a stone. "One of Sullivan's hunters. He was alone, separated from the others. He slipped on wet rocks above the falls." Matthew studied her face, seeing the steel beneath her calm exterior. "You helped him slip." She met his gaze unflinchingly. "He would have killed us both without hesitation." He couldn't argue with that. In the harsh justice of the frontier, survival often trumped morality. He'd made similar choices as a ranger, as a sheriff, decisions that haunted his dreams but had kept him alive. "How many in their party?" he asked. 5 that I saw, professional hunters, not town men." She mixed the crushed herbs with pine sap to form a poultice. They know these mountains. Matthew nodded grimly. Sullivan had sent his best, men accustomed to tracking fugitives through wilderness. We need to move as soon as possible, find somewhere more defensible. There's a place, Naeli said, moving to his side with the poultice. An old trapper's cabin near Eagle Creek. 3 days' journey from here. 3 days is too long. They'll find us before then. Not if we travel by night, hide by day. She gently removed his makeshift bandage, applying the poultice to his wound. The mixture burned, then numbed the pain. The cabin has supplies, weapons perhaps. The old trapper was a friend to my people. Matthew hissed as she rebandaged the wound, tighter than before. You trust this trapper? He is dead 2 winters now, she replied, but he would have helped us. He hated Sullivan more than most. Most people have reason to hate Sullivan, Matthew said, but few stand against him. Neely sat back on her heels, studying him. You did, once. The accusation in her tone was unmistakable. Matthew felt a flash of anger, then a deeper shame. And I paid the price. As did my people. Her voice was level, but her eyes burned. The difference is they had no choice. The words struck him like physical blows. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. You think I don't know that? That I don't live with it every day? I think you have been hiding from it, she replied, dwelling in grief rather than seeking justice. Justice, Matthew laughed bitterly. There's no justice in this territory. Sullivan owns the courts, the law. Then we make our own justice. She stood, moving back to the fire, as my people did before the white man came with his paper laws. Matthew watched her, seeing the proud bearing of Black Elk in her posture, the same unflinching courage. Chief Black Elk had saved Matthew's life once, taken a bullet meant for him during a Comanche raid. The debt remained unpaid. What's your plan? He finally asked. Kill Sullivan? They'll hunt you to the ends of the earth. Not kill, she said. Expose. The document you took from Harker is only the beginning. There is more proof. Matthew's interest sharpened. What proof? Sullivan keeps a ledger, all his secrets, his bribes, his murders, including orders for my people's massacre. I saw it when I worked in his house. And you think he just leaves this lying around? Hidden, she corrected, in a floor safe beneath his desk. I was searching for it when I was discovered. Matthew considered this. A detailed ledger in Sullivan's own hand would be damning evidence, enough to bring the territorial governor or even federal marshals into the picture. Even if this ledger exists, he said slowly, getting to it would be impossible. Sullivan's house is a fortress. Not during the Founders' Day celebration, Neely countered. 3 days from now, Sullivan hosts the town at his mansion. Everyone will be there, including all his guards. You want to walk into Sullivan's house during a party? Matthew stared at her. That's suicide. Not if we have help. She met his gaze steadily. Your friend at the saloon, Sam Wilson, he would assist us? Matthew hesitated. Sam was one of the few people in Redemption Creek not fully under Sullivan's thumb, but he was also a cautious man. Sam risks enough just by speaking to me. This would put him directly in Sullivan's crosshairs. Is he a man of courage? He's a man of survival, Matthew replied, like most in Redemption Creek. Neely added more wood to the fire. Then we must give him reason to help beyond friendship. The document you took, it implicates more than Sullivan, yes? Matthew pulled the letter from his pocket, rereading it in the firelight. It mentions several prominent men in town as being compensated for their silence, including Judge Harmon and Mayor Fletcher. Leverage, Nellie said, satisfaction in her voice. If your friend fears Sullivan, give him more reason to fear Sullivan's fall when these names become public. Matthew had to admire her strategic thinking. You've thought this through. For 10 years, I have thought of little else. The intensity in her voice reminded him that her quest for justice had consumed her life, just as grief had consumed his. But while he had retreated from the world, she had continued to fight. If we do this, he said slowly, we'll need more than Sam's help. We'll need a way out of town afterward, somewhere to go until we can reach the governor in Denver. The trapper's cabin first, she insisted. Then north, through the high passes where horses struggle to follow. My father showed me routes through the mountains that few white men know. Matthew nodded. It was a desperate plan, with too many ways it could go wrong. But sitting in this cave waiting for Sullivan's men to find them would only end one way. We move tonight, he decided, as soon as it's dark. Nellie's smile was fierce in the firelight. Good. The Shadow Wolf returns to the hunt. Matthew wasn't so sure. The man he'd once been seemed distant, a memory blurred by years of grief and isolation. But something was stirring inside him, a sense of purpose he'd thought forever lost beneath the weight of failure. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen. Dusk settled over the mountains like a purple shroud, stars appearing one by one in the deepening sky. Matthew stood at the cave entrance, testing his strength. The wound still burned with every movement, but Naeli's medicine had reduced the swelling and kept fever at bay. He could walk. Not far, not fast, but enough to start their journey. Naeli joined him, her pack slung over one shoulder. She'd fashioned a crude holster for Harker's revolver from strips of leather and wore it low on her hip, gunfighter style. Ready? She asked. Matthew nodded, Winchester cradled in his arms. Lead the way. They set out into the gathering darkness, moving carefully along game trails that wound through the pine forest. Nellie set a deliberate pace, slow enough for Matthew's wounded body but steady, eating up distance with each passing hour. They traveled in silence, ears attuned to any sound that might signal danger. Twice they froze at the distant howl of a wolf, and once at the crack of a branch that proved to be nothing more than a deer bounding away through the underbrush. No sign of Sullivan's hunters, but Matthew knew they were out there, quartering the mountains like the professionals they were. It was only a matter of time before their paths crossed. The moon rose, 3/4 full, casting silver light through the pine branches. Enough to see by, but also enough to be seen. They kept to the shadows where possible, using the terrain to their advantage. After 3 hours, Matthew's strength began to flag. The wound had reopened, warm blood seeping through the bandage to stain his shirt. His breath came in short gasps, each step an exercise in will. Naeli noticed his faltering pace and called a halt in a small clearing surrounded by dense pines. Rest, she ordered. I will check our back trail. Matthew sank gratefully onto a fallen log, propping the rifle beside him. He pressed a hand to his side, feeling the wetness there, and knew he was pushing his body too hard, too soon. But they had no choice. Sullivan's men would find the cave eventually, and the hunt would intensify. Naeli returned silently, materializing from the shadows like a spirit. Clear, she reported, but we cannot linger. I know. Matthew forced himself to his feet, swaying slightly. I'm slowing you down. We move together or not at all, she said firmly. That's not practical. Sullivan wants both of us dead, but you're the one he fears most, the last living witness to his crimes against your people. And you now carry the proof of those crimes, she countered. We need each other, Shadow Wolf. Before he could argue further, a new sound reached them, the jingle of tack, the soft thud of hooves on pine needles. Horses moving slowly through the forest, perhaps a 1/4 mile away. Down, Matthew whispered, pulling Nellie to a crouch beside him. They listened intently as the sounds grew closer. 2 horses, maybe 3, approaching from the southwest, the direction they had been heading. They're cutting us off, Matthew realized, circling ahead based on our likely path. Smart hunters, Neely murmured. They know we head for lower ground, for water. Matthew's mind raced through options, each more desperate than the last. They couldn't outrun mounted men, not with his injury. Fighting would mean facing superior numbers with limited ammunition. We need to split up, he decided. I'll lead them west along the ridgeline. You continue to the trapper's cabin. Neely's face hardened. No. It's the only way. They'll follow a wounded man. Easier tracking, easier kill. It gives you a chance to reach safety. And you, she challenged, what chance does this give you? Matthew's smile was grim in the moonlight. I've lived past my time already. 5 years on borrowed days. I will not leave you today, she insisted. My father would never forgive such dishonor. Your father would understand survival, Matthew countered. The document in my pocket is nothing compared to what you know, what you've seen. Your testimony, combined with Sullivan's ledger, could bring him down. That's what matters. The sound of horses grew closer, perhaps only minutes away now. They needed to decide quickly. Nieli's eyes flashed with anger, but also resignation. She knew he was right, tactically if not morally. 3 days, she finally said. I will wait 3 days at the trapper's cabin. If you do not come by then get to Denver, he finished for her. Find Territorial Governor Adams. Tell him everything. She nodded, then did something unexpected. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his, an Apache gesture of respect between warriors. Ride well into the Shadowlands, brother, if that is your path, she said in her native tongue. I am not finished fighting yet, he replied in the same language. Matthew reached into his pocket and withdrew Harker's letter. Take this. If I'm captured, they'll search me. Keep it safe. She accepted the document, tucking it securely inside her clothing. How will you escape them? You can barely walk. I don't need to outrun them, Matthew said. Just lead them away from you. The horses were close now, perhaps only a few hundred yards distant. Any moment, Sullivan's men would reach the clearing. Go, Matthew urged. Head northeast instead of west. Cross the high ridge. They won't expect that. Nellie hesitated a moment longer, conflict clear on her face. Then she squeezed his arm once and disappeared into the darkness, moving as silently as her ancestors had taught her. Matthew waited until she was gone, then moved in the opposite direction, deliberately making more noise than necessary. He stumbled westward, leaving an obvious trail, broken branches, disturbed ground, even a few drops of blood from his reopened wound. Let them follow him. Let them waste their time hunting a man already half dead. It might be enough to give Nayeli the space she needed. He'd gone perhaps a quarter mile when he heard them. Voices, low and urgent, discussing the trail he'd left. They'd found his sign, as he'd intended. Now the real hunt would begin. Matthew quickened his pace, pushing his wounded body to its limits. The terrain grew steeper as he ascended the ridge, pine giving way to bare rock and stunted juniper. His breath came in ragged gasps, each step sending fresh waves of pain through his side. Behind him, the voices grew louder. 3 men at least, moving fast now that they'd found his trail. They were gaining ground quickly. Matthew reached a rock outcropping and crouched behind it, Winchester ready. He would make his stand here, sell his life as dearly as possible, give Nayeli more time to escape. The first hunter appeared below, a silhouette against the moonlit forest. Matthew steadied the rifle, drawing a bead on the man's chest. An easy shot, no more than 50 yards. His finger tightened on the trigger. The shot echoed across the mountainside, followed immediately by a cry of pain. The hunter collapsed, clutching his shoulder. Sniper on the rocks, another voice shouted. Spread out! Matthew ducked as return fire chipped stone inches from his head. He worked the Winchester's action, chambering another round, and waited for the next target to show himself. A figure darted between trees below. Matthew led him slightly, accounting for movement, and fired again. The man stumbled but kept running, finding cover behind a massive pine. 2 shots left in the Winchester. Then only Harker's revolver with its 3 remaining bullets. Not enough to hold off determined hunters for long. Matthew changed position, scrambling to another outcrop as bullets whined overhead. His wound screamed in protest, fresh blood soaking the bandage. He was leaving a clear trail now, but it didn't matter. They had him cornered. The shooting paused. In the silence that followed, a new voice called out from below. Cole! Matthew Cole! Can you hear me? Matthew tensed. He knew that voice, Sheriff Jenkins, his former deputy, now Sullivan's man. I hear you, Jenkins, he called back, voice rasping. You're bleeding out up there, Cole. No way off this mountain except through us. Then I'll die up here, Matthew replied. Won't be the first man to end on a mountaintop. Doesn't have to be that way, Jenkins insisted. Sullivan wants the Apache woman, not you. Tell us where she's headed, and you can ride out of here. My word on it. Matthew laughed bitterly. Your word? You sold that along with your conscience when you pinned on that star. A pause. You're not wrong about that, Jenkins admitted, surprising Matthew with his candor. But this offer comes direct from Sullivan himself. He respects you, Cole. Always has, even when he was working to bring you down. If he respected me, he wouldn't have had my family killed, Matthew shot back. Silence stretched long after his words. Then Jenkins spoke again. His voice changed, harder. What are you talking about, Cole? You know exactly what I'm talking about, Matthew said, though a seed of doubt had been planted. Jenkins seemed genuinely confused. The fever that took Sarah and William. Convenient timing, wasn't it? right after I started investigating Sullivan's involvement in the Apache massacre. Another pause. When Jenkins spoke again, his voice was lower, meant only for Matthew. I didn't know about that. I swear it. I knew Sullivan wanted you gone as sheriff, but not that. You expect me to believe that? Matthew demanded. You've been Sullivan's dog for 5 years. I've been surviving, Jenkins corrected, like everyone else in Redemption Creek. But there are lines even Sullivan's men won't cross. Family is one of them. Matthew wanted to dismiss the words as lies, but something in Jenkins' tone gave him pause. The man had been his deputy for 3 years, a friend before that. They'd ridden together, fought together, until Sullivan had driven the wedge between them. If what you're saying is true, Matthew called back, then you've been serving a man who murdered a woman and child, my wife, my son. How does that sit with you, Tom? The use of Jenkins' first name, a deliberate reminder of their former friendship, hung in the air between them. I need to know more, Cole, Jenkins finally replied. Tell me what you know. So you can report back to Sullivan? I'm not that far gone yet. No, damn it, so I can... Jenkins cut himself off. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, urgent. The others are coming back. Listen to me. There's a line shack 2 miles east of here near the old Silver Prospect. Be there at dawn if you want to talk. Before Matthew could respond, a barrage of gunfire erupted from below, but it wasn't directed at him. The shots were wild, scattered, accompanied by shouts of alarm. Bear, someone yelled. Christ almighty, it's on Jenkins. More shots, a scream of pain, human or animal, Matthew couldn't tell. Then running feet, panicked voices fading into the distance. Silence fell over the mountainside once more. Matthew waited, Winchester trained on the forest below, but no further threats materialized. After 10 minutes of tense watching, he eased back from the outcropping. Had it really been a bear, attacking at that precise moment? The timing seemed too perfect, the distraction too convenient. Unless... Matthew scanned the ridgeline to the east, where the rising moon illuminated a familiar silhouette against the sky. Nieli stood motionless on a distant outcrop, watching. She raised a hand in silent acknowledgement, then melted away into the shadows. She hadn't left him after all. Somehow she had circled around and created the distraction that saved his life. The debt to her family grew heavier. Matthew slumped against the rocks, exhaustion washing over him. Jenkins' words echoed in his mind. Had Sullivan truly ordered the deaths of Sarah and William? He'd always suspected, but never had confirmation. And now Jenkins, Sullivan's man, seemed genuinely shocked by the suggestion. What game was the sheriff playing? A trap, most likely. The line shack meeting would be an ambush, an easy way to finish what they'd started. Yet something in Jenkins' voice had rung true. The man had sounded genuinely disturbed by Matthew's accusation. Dawn was only a few hours away. Matthew had a decision to make. Trust his old friend and risk a trap, or continue his desperate flight through the mountains, wounded and alone. The answer came more easily than he expected. He was tired of running, tired of hiding from the truth. If there was even a chance that Jenkins could provide answers about Sarah and William's deaths, it was worth the risk. Matthew checked his weapons one last time, then began the painful descent toward the line shack. Whatever waited for him there, truth or betrayal, he would face it head on. The hunt had taken an unexpected turn, and for the first time in 5 years, Matthew Cole felt truly alive. The journey to the line shack took longer than Matthew had anticipated, his wounded body protesting every step of the descent. By the time gray dawn light filtered through the pines, sweat had soaked through his shirt despite the morning chill. The small structure stood in a clearing, weather-beaten and listing slightly to one side, a relic from earlier mining days when prospectors had dotted these mountains seeking fortune. Most had found only hardship, as would Matthew if this meeting proved to be a trap. Matthew circled the shack once, his Winchester ready, senses heightened by a mixture of pain and alertness. The clearing was quiet, the only movement a pair of ravens watching from a dead pine nearby. No horses were visible, no fresh tracks in the soft earth. If Jenkins was here, he'd come alone and on foot, either a sign of good faith or a clever ploy to make the trap less obvious. Winchester ready, Matthew approached the door. It hung ajar, warped from seasons of mountain weather. He nudged it open with the rifle barrel and waited, listening. I'm alone, Cole. Jenkins' voice came from inside, tired and resigned. No tricks. Matthew stepped into the dim interior. The shack was a single room with a dirt floor, containing only a rusted stove, a rough wooden table, and a narrow cot against one wall. Jenkins sat on the edge of the cot, his sheriff's badge glinting dully in the light from the single window. His gun belt lay on the table, out of reach. You came, Jenkins observed. Wasn't sure you would. Neither was I. Matthew kept the Winchester trained on his former deputy. Hands where I can see them. Jenkins raised his hands slowly. You look like hell, Cole. Being shot tends to do that. Matthew remained standing, too wary to take a seat despite the screaming pain in his side. You said you wanted to talk. So talk. Jenkins studied him for a long moment. The man had aged in the 5 years since they'd worked together. His face more lined, hair graying at the temples, eyes holding a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. Did Sullivan really have your family killed? Jenkins asked finally. You tell me, Matthew countered. You've been wearing his leash for years. Jenkins winced at the accusation but didn't deny it. I know Sullivan wanted you gone as sheriff. You were asking too many questions about the Apache massacre, getting too close to the truth. But murder, women and children? He shook his head. I never heard orders like that. Yet they died, Matthew said flatly. Convenient timing. The fever took half a dozen others that month, Jenkins pointed out, including my sister's boy. Was that Sullivan too? Matthew hesitated. It was true. The fever had swept through Redemption Creek that spring, claiming multiple victims. He'd always assumed Sarah and William were targeted specifically. But what if not Sullivan, then who turned the town against us? Matthew demanded. No doctor would come. No neighbors would help. They left them to die. Shame crossed Jenkins' face. That was Sullivan's doing, right enough. He spread word that you were sympathizing with the Apache, that you were betraying the town, made it dangerous for anyone to help you. He looked down at his hands, myself included. The admission hung between them, heavy with 5 years of unspoken recrimination. You were my friend, Tom, Matthew said quietly. You stood at my wedding. You were William's godfather. I know. Jenkins couldn't meet his eyes. I've lived with that every day since, Brabham. Not hard enough to make you take off that badge. The badge was the only way I could stay, Jenkins countered, finally looking up. Someone had to remain who remembered what it once stood for, what you made it stand for. Matthew laughed bitterly. And how's that working out? You're hunting me through the mountains on Sullivan's orders. I'm here, aren't I? Jenkins spread his hands. Lone. Talking to you instead of putting a bullet in you. Why? Matthew asked bluntly. Why now, after 5 years? Jenkins was silent for a moment, weighing his words. Because I heard about Two Hawks yesterday. The things he said to you before they hanged him. He paused. And because I know about the Apache woman. Sullivan's going crazy trying to find her. What's she to Sullivan? He says she's stirring up the remnants of the Apache bands, planning attacks on the railroad. But that's horseshit. Jenkins leaned forward. The truth is he's scared of her. Really scared in a way I've never seen before. Matthew kept his face expressionless, giving nothing away. And why would Sullivan fear one Apache woman? That's what I want to know, Jenkins said. There's something he's not telling us. Something big enough to have him send every gun he can hire into these mountains. He paused. Something worth killing old friends over. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of shared history and broken trust. I need to know what's happening, Cole, Jenkins finally said. What's this really about? Why is Sullivan so desperate to find this woman? Matthew weighed his options. Jenkins seemed genuine, but 5 years was a long time. People changed, loyalties shifted. If he was still Sullivan's man, any information would go straight back to the mining baron. But if Jenkins was truly having doubts, he could be a valuable ally, perhaps their only chance to expose Sullivan's crimes. She's Chief Black Elk's daughter, Matthew said finally, the last survivor of the White Mountain Massacre. Jenkins' eyes widened. Christ, I thought they were all killed. She was away from the camp when Sullivan's men attacked. She spent the last 10 years hiding, gathering evidence against Sullivan. Evidence of what? That it wasn't a Comanche raid that wiped out her people. It was Sullivan's men, dressed as Indians, executing a massacre so Sullivan could claim the tribe's land for his mining operations. Jenkins paled visibly. That's, that's the truth, Matthew finished for him, and we can prove it. How? Harker was carrying a letter, a confession from Sullivan's former second-in-command before he killed himself. And according to Nellie, there's more, a ledger in Sullivan's house detailing everything, including payoffs to officials. Jenkins stood abruptly, pacing the small confines of the shack. If this is true, you know it's true, Matthew interrupted. You've always known it. You just didn't want to admit you were working for a mass murderer. Jenkins stopped, shoulders slumping. What do you want from me, Cole? Why tell me all this? Because I need to know, Matthew said, his voice lowering. Did Sullivan order the deaths of my family? Not just the town turning against us. Did he specifically target Sarah and William? Jenkins turned back to face him, conflict clear in his eyes. I don't know for certain, he admitted. But there was something. After they died, Sullivan was too pleased, said it had worked out better than expected. I thought he meant you're leaving town, giving up the investigation. He shook his head. Now I'm not so sure. Matthew absorbed this, the confirmation of his darkest suspicions landing like a physical blow. He'd spent 5 years trying to convince himself that Sarah and William had been collateral damage in Sullivan's campaign against him, victims of circumstance, not deliberate targets. The possibility that their deaths had been not just convenient for Sullivan, but planned by him. There's more, Jenkins continued, hesitation clear in his voice. After you left town, Sullivan had Doc Miller paid off to leave too, gave him a small fortune to relocate to California. Always seems strange to me. The town doctor? Matthew frowned. Why would Sullivan care about him? That's what I couldn't figure. Until now. Jenkins met Matthew's eyes steadily. What if Miller knew something about how Sarah and William really died? Something worth paying to keep quiet. The implication hung in the air between them. Not fever, but poison. Not neglect, but murder. Matthew's hand tightened on the Winchester until his knuckles whitened. The grief he'd carried for 5 years transformed, crystallizing into something harder, sharper. A blade of pure rage. I'm going to kill him, he said, the words flat and certain. You'll never get close enough, Jenkins countered. Sullivan's house is a fortress, and after what happened with Harker, he's doubled his security. I'll find a way. And throw away any chance of justice? Jenkins shook his head. If you kill Sullivan, you'll hang. The evidence against him dies with him. He becomes a martyr, and you become just another savage killer. The words cut through Matthew's anger, forcing him to think past the red haze of vengeance. Jenkins was right. Killing Sullivan would bring personal satisfaction, but not justice, not for the Apache, not for Sarah and William, not for all the others who had suffered under his tyranny. What's your suggestion then, Sheriff? Matthew asked, a hint of his old sardonic tone returning. Jenkins seemed to make a decision, squaring his shoulders. The Founders' Day celebration. 3 days from now, Sullivan's hosting it at his mansion as he does every year. Every important person in the territory will be there, including the territorial representative from Denver. Crawford, Matthew recalled the man, a politician with ambitions for higher office. He's in Sullivan's pocket. Not anymore, Jenkins said. Sullivan overreached, tried to force Crawford to sign over federal grants for the railroad. Crawford refused. There's bad blood now. Matthew considered this. A territorial representative with a grudge against Sullivan and the authority to launch a federal investigation. It could work. We'd never get inside, he pointed out. Sullivan's men know both our faces. A faint smile touched Jenkins' lips. I'm the sheriff. I have an invitation. And guests. And Nayeli, the most important witness? That's trickier, Jenkins admitted, but not impossible. Sullivan employs Apache women as kitchen staff during big events. They work cheaper than white women, with the right clothes, the right timing. It's a huge risk, Matthew said, but he was already turning the plan over in his mind, seeing its possibilities. Bigger risk is doing nothing, Jenkins replied. Sullivan's not going to stop. He's expanding his operations, pushing deeper into Apache territory. There will be more massacres, more innocent deaths. He paused. More families like yours, Cole. The words struck home, reminding Matthew of what had once driven him, not just personal vengeance, but a deeper sense of justice, a belief that the law should protect the innocent, not the powerful. "Why the change of heart, Tom?" Matthew asked quietly. "Why now, after 5 years of wearing Sullivan's star?" Jenkins was silent for a long moment. "Because I watched them hang two hawks yesterday," he finally said. "An innocent man, and I did nothing. Just like I did nothing when the town turned against you, when your family needed help." He looked down at the badge on his chest. "This used to mean something. You made it mean something." Matthew studied his former deputy, searching for deception and finding only shame and resolve. It could still be an elaborate trap, but his instincts, once the sharpest tools in his arsenal, told him Jenkins was genuine. "If we do this," Matthew said slowly, "there's no going back. Sullivan will know you've betrayed him. You'll be as marked as I am." "I've been marked since the day I took his badge," Jenkins replied. "Just took me too long to admit it." Matthew nodded, decision made. "We'll need to reach Neely. She's headed for an old trapper's cabin near Eagle Creek." "I know the place," Jenkins said. "Ben Miller's old hideaway. 3 hours ride from here." "You have horses?" "Hidden half a mile south. 2 of them." Matthew lowered the Winchester finally, the weight of distrust lifting slightly. "Then let's move. Sullivan's hunters won't be far behind." Jenkins retrieved his gun belt, buckling it with the practiced ease of long habit. "One thing, Cole, if Sullivan did order the deaths of your family, if we get proof of that, what then?" Matthew's eyes were cold as winter stars. "Then all bets are off. Evidence or no evidence, justice or no justice. I'll put a bullet in him myself." Jenkins nodded, accepting this. "Fair enough. I might even help you do it." They left the line shack, moving south through the forest toward Jenkins' hidden horses. The alliance was fragile, built on damaged trust and shared guilt. But it was a beginning. For the first time in 5 years, Matthew felt the stirring of something that might have been hope. Or perhaps it was simply the hunter's anticipation of closing in on prey. The trapper's cabin was smaller than Matthew had expected, little more than a one-room structure built of rough-hewn logs, nestled in a grove of aspens near a swift-flowing creek. Age had darkened the wood almost black, and moss grew thick on the northern side where shadows lingered longest. They approached cautiously, leaving the horses tethered 100 yards back. Jenkins took the lead, his hand resting on his revolver as they circled the cabin once, checking for signs of occupation or danger. "No smoke," Jenkins noted. "No tracks except deer and coyote." "She's cautious," Matthew replied. "She wouldn't make it obvious she's here." Jenkins nodded, understanding. "How do we approach without getting shot?" Matthew considered this. Nellie would be watching, wary of pursuers. 2 armed men approaching would put her on high alert. "Nellie," he called in Apache, "Shadow Wolf comes with a friend. We mean no harm." Silence answered him, broken only by the rustle of aspen leaves in the breeze and the gurgle of the nearby creek. Matthew was about to call again when the cabin door creaked open slightly. "Enter alone, Shadow Wolf," came Naeli's voice, also in Apache. "The other waits outside." Matthew glanced at Jenkins, who raised his eyebrows questioningly. "She wants me to come in alone," Matthew explained. "You wait here." Jenkins frowned but nodded. "Call if you need me, and Cole," he hesitated. "Be careful. I've stuck my neck out pretty far already." Matthew approached the cabin slowly, hands visible. The door swung wider as he reached it, revealing Naeli standing just inside. Harker's revolver pointed steadily at his chest. "You trust too easily," she said in Apache, eyes flicking to where Jenkins waited at the edge of the clearing. "That man wears Sullivan's star." "He also wears the guilt of serving Sullivan," Matthew replied in the same tongue. "He wants to make amends." He stepped inside and Neely closed the door behind him, keeping the gun trained on him. The cabin interior was spare, a small stone fireplace, a narrow cot, a table with one chair, and shelves holding a few supplies. A hunting rifle leaned in one corner, and dried herbs hung from the rafters. "He could be leading Sullivan's men to us," she said, switching to English. "If he wanted me dead, he'd have done it already," Matthew countered. "He had his chance in the line shack." Nellie's eyes narrowed. "You met with him? After he hunted us?" "He saved my life," Matthew said. Called off the other hunters when they had me cornered. Why would he do this? Because he's remembered what side he's supposed to be on. Matthew winced, pressing a hand to his wounded side. The long ride had reopened the wound again, fresh blood dampening the bandage. Nieli lowered the revolver slightly, concern flickering across her face. You need rest. The wound festers. No time for that. Matthew eased himself onto the single chair. Jenkins has information, a plan to expose Sullivan. He explained quickly the Founders' Day celebration, Crawford's presence, the possibility of getting the evidence directly to someone with federal authority. Nellie listened intently, her expression guarded. And you trust this plan? She asked when he finished. This man who has served Sullivan for years. Trust isn't the right word, Matthew admitted, but I believe he wants to set things right, and it's our best chance to bring Sullivan down legally, publicly. Niali moved to the fireplace, stirring a small pot that hung over the banked coals. The aroma of medicinal herbs filled the cabin. The white man's law has never served my people, she said. Why would it start now? Because we'll have evidence even they can't ignore. The letter from Harker, Sullivan's own ledger, your testimony as a witness. Matthew leaned forward, wincing at the pain the movement caused. And a former sheriff ready to stand with you. She turned to face him, studying his expression. And if this fails, if Sullivan escapes justice again, then I'll kill him myself, Matthew said simply. Consequences be damned. Something in his tone, the flat certainty, the cold resolve, seemed to convince her. She nodded slowly. I will consider this plan. But first, your wound needs tending. She retrieved the pot from the fire. Remove your shirt. Matthew complied with difficulty, the dried blood making the fabric stick to his skin. The wound looked worse than he'd feared, red and inflamed, the edges puffy. Fever would follow soon if infection took hold. Nieli examined it with practiced hands. The bullet path is clean but poisoned, she pronounced. I will draw out the sickness. She began applying the hot poultice, its bitter smell making Matthew's eyes water. Jenkins says you're Black Elk's daughter, he said, partly to distract himself from the pain of her ministrations. Yes. She wrapped fresh bandages around his torso, her touch efficient but gentle. My father spoke often of you, the white man who became Apache in his heart. I never became Apache, Matthew corrected. I was just a wounded man who found kindness among your people when I expected none. You learned our ways, our language. You hunted with our warriors and sat in council with our elders. She tied off the bandage. In all but blood, you were one of us. Until I left, Matthew said, the old guilt surfacing. I should have done more when Sullivan's men came. I should have seen it coming. You tried, she reminded him. You lost your badge, your place in the white man's world, trying to prove what Sullivan had done. And failed. Matthew pulled his shirt back on carefully. It wasn't enough. Perhaps this time will be different. She put away her supplies, her movements precise and economical. With your sheriff friend in the evidence we seek. Matthew watched her, struck again by the strength in her bearing, the dignity that neither captivity nor years of hiding had diminished. Black Elk's daughter indeed. She carried her father's spirit, his unflinching courage. There's something else you should know, he said finally. Something Jenkins told me about my family. Her expression softened slightly. Your wife and son, you spoke of them when fever took you in the cave. Matthew hadn't known that, hadn't realized he'd called for them in his delirium. The thought made him uncomfortable, as if a private grief had been laid bare. Jenkins believes Sullivan may have had them killed, he continued, forcing the words past the tightness in his throat. Not just abandoned to the fever, but deliberately poisoned. Nieli's eyes flashed with understanding. This is why you now agree to his plan, not just for my people's justice, but for your own. Does that make it less worthy? Matthew challenged. No, she said simply. It makes it more human. She moved to the door. I will speak with your sheriff friend. If his eyes are honest, I will consider his plan. She opened the door and gestured for Jenkins to approach. The sheriff came cautiously, removing his hat as he entered the cabin. Ma'am, he said, nodding respectfully to Neely. I'm Sheriff Tom Jenkins. I know who you are, she replied coolly. The question is, do you? Jenkins accepted the rebuke with a slight nod. I've been Sullivan's man for too long, he acknowledged. I want to make that right. Many wrongs have been done, she said. Don't cannot be made right. No, Jenkins agreed, but we can stop more from happening, and we can bring Sullivan to justice. For your people, for Cole's family, for everyone he's harmed. Nellie studied him with the same penetrating gaze she'd turned on Matthew. Whatever she saw in Jenkins' face seemed to satisfy her, for she gave a short nod. I will hear your plan, she said. All of it. Then I will decide. Jenkins laid out the details. The Founders' Day celebration 3 days hence, the layout of Sullivan's mansion, the security arrangements, the presence of Territorial Representative Crawford and other officials. As he spoke, he pulled a folded paper from his jacket, a rough map of Sullivan's estate. The ledger is in a safe beneath Sullivan's desk, Neely confirmed, examining the map. I saw him access it once, when he thought no servants were present. Can you open it? Matthew asked. She shook her head. It requires a key and a combination, but she hesitated, then reached into her dress, withdrawing a small object wrapped in leather. I took this before I was discovered. She unwrapped the leather to reveal a key, small, ornate, made of brass. Jenkins' eyes widened. You stole Sullivan's safe key? I had planned to return for the combination, she explained, but they caught me before I could. This changes things, Jenkins said, excitement creeping into his voice. With the key, we only need the combination, and Sullivan keeps all important numbers in a small book he carries in his breast pocket. I've seen him consult it when opening the main safe in his office. So we need to get the book, Matthew summarized. During a crowded party in a house full of Sullivan's men, without raising an alarm. Jenkins nodded grimly. That's about the size of it. The three fell silent, each contemplating the enormity of the task before them. It can be done, Neely finally said, but not as you planned. I will not enter as a servant. There is too much risk of recognition. Then how? Jenkins asked. A slow smile spread across her face, the first Matthew had seen from her. It transformed her features, revealing a glimpse of the woman she might have been in a different life, without the weight of tragedy and vengeance. As a guest, she said, the white man sees what he expects to see. He does not look closely at what is before him. Matthew and Jenkins exchanged glances. It's insane, Jenkins said slowly, but it just might work. We'll need appropriate clothes, Matthew pointed out, and a story that will hold up to scrutiny. Leave that to me, Jenkins replied. I have resources in town Sullivan doesn't know about. Nellie returned to the map, studying it intently. 3 days, she said. 3 days to prepare for one night that will change everything. Matthew looked from her to Jenkins, feeling the weight of what they were undertaking. 3 damaged souls united by a common enemy, by shared loss and guilt, by the hope of justice long denied. It was a fragile alliance built on tentative trust and desperate necessity, but it was all they had. 3 days, he agreed, and then Sullivan pays for everything. Night had fallen by the time they finished their planning. Jenkins had departed to make his preparations in town, leaving Matthew and Nellie alone in the trapper's cabin. The wind outside had grown stronger, whistling through the cracks in the aging structure, carrying the promise of another storm. Matthew sat before the fire, cleaning his revolver with methodical precision. The familiar routine was calming, allowing his mind to process the day's revelations. Sullivan had not just ruined his life, he had deliberately taken his family. The knowledge sat like a stone in his chest, heavy, cold, immovable. Nayeli moved quietly around the cabin, arranging herbs to dry, checking supplies. Her efficiency spoke of years spent surviving on her own, always ready to move, to hide, to fight if necessary. Yet there was a grace to her movements, a dignity that transcended her circumstances. Tell me about them, she said suddenly, settling on the floor near the fire. Your wife and son. Matthew's hands stilled on the weapon. No one had asked him about Sarah and William in years. No one had dared. The question should have angered him, reopened wounds too painful to touch. Instead, he felt an unexpected relief, as if a door long sealed had finally been unlatched. Sarah was... He began, then stopped, searching for words adequate to describe the woman who had been his heart. She was stronger than me, braver in the ways that mattered. When I took a stand against Sullivan, she never wavered, even knowing the risk. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. She had this laugh that could fill a room, made you believe everything would be all right, even when it wouldn't. He resumed cleaning the revolver, eyes fixed on the task, but his mind elsewhere. William was 8 when they died, smart as a whip, wanted to be a sheriff like his pa. His voice roughened. Had this wooden star I carved him. Wore it everywhere. Nieli listened silently, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. When he fell quiet, she spoke softly. My mother had a song she would sing when storms came. She said it was to remind the sky that we were not afraid of its anger. She hummed a few notes, a melody strange and beautiful in its unfamiliarity. I was 12 when Sullivan's men came. I had gone with my cousin to gather herbs in the high valley. When we returned, her voice didn't break, but her hands stilled in their work. My father was a proud man, but gentle. He believed we could find a way to live alongside the white settlers. He trusted in words and treaties. Bitterness edged her tone. Sullivan taught him the value of white men's promises. Matthew set the cleaned revolver aside. Black Elk saved my life, he said. Not just by taking the bullet meant for me, by showing me a different way to see the world. I owed him better than I gave. You tried, Nellie acknowledged. Few white men would have risked what you did. It wasn't enough. No, she agreed, but perhaps tomorrow will be. They sat in silence for a time, the fire crackling between them, each lost in memories of what had been taken, what could never be recovered. Yet in sharing their losses, something new had formed, a bridge across the chasm of their separate griefs. If we succeed, Matthew said eventually, what then? After 10 years of hunting Sullivan? I have thought of little else, she admitted. Revenge has been my purpose for so long. She looked up at him, her expression softening slightly. But I remember other things too. My father taught that life must be built, not just avenged. The land remains. What is scattered can be gathered. And you? He asked. Where will you go when this is done? Where I belong, she said simply, to the mountains, to what remains of my people. She studied him, a question in her gaze. And you, Shadow Wolf? What will you build from the ashes Sullivan leaves behind? The question struck deeper than he expected. For 5 years, he had existed rather than lived, a ghost haunting the margins of his own life. The thought of a future beyond vengeance was both terrifying and strangely hopeful. I don't know, he answered honestly. Haven't thought past seeing Sullivan answer for what he's done. Nellie nodded understanding. When a river has run dry for many seasons, it does not remember at first how to flow, but the path remains in the earth, waiting. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the roof. The storm had arrived, but inside the cabin, something long frozen had begun, imperceptibly, to thaw. We should rest, Nieli said, rising gracefully. Tomorrow will demand all our strength. Matthew nodded, but as she moved toward her bedroll in the corner, he spoke again. Thank you, he said quietly. She turned, questioning. For asking about them, he clarified. Sarah and William, no one has in a long time. Those we have lost live on in our stories, she replied. My people believe that to speak their names is to honor their spirits. She settled into her blankets, but her presence remained with him, a warmth more lasting than the fires. For the first time in 5 years, the memories of Sarah and William brought not just pain, but something else. Something that felt dangerously like healing. Redemption. Creek appeared unchanged as they approached from the east, keeping to the tree line that bordered Sullivan's vast properties. The town sprawled in the valley below, a jumble of wooden buildings surrounding the main street, dominated at one end by Sullivan's mansion on the hill and at the other by his silver mine operations. Smoke rose from smelter chimneys, a constant reminder of the source of Sullivan's power and wealth. Matthew studied the familiar skyline with mixed emotions. He hadn't laid eyes on the town in 5 years, not since the day he'd buried Sarah and William and turned his back on civilization. Now he was returning to the place of his greatest pain, his greatest failure. Town's grown, he observed. New buildings had sprung up on the outskirts, and a railroad spur now connected the mines directly to the main line 10 miles south. Sullivan's been expanding, Jenkins confirmed. New silver strike last year brought in fresh money, fresh blood, half the town's new faces since you left. That works in our favor, Matthew noted. Fewer people who might recognize me. They retreated back into the forest to their makeshift camp, where Nayeli waited. Jenkins had brought them to an abandoned hunter's cabin on the edge of Sullivan's property, remote enough to remain undetected, close enough to observe the town. For 2 days they had prepared, Jenkins making daily rides into town to gather supplies and intelligence while Matthew recovered his strength. The wound in his side was healing slowly. The herbal poultices Nieli applied twice daily, drawing out infection and reducing inflammation. He would never be at full strength by tomorrow night's celebration, but he would be strong enough. He had to be. Nieli looked up from the fire as they entered the cabin. What news? Jenkins removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. Preparations for the celebration are in full swing. Sullivan's doubled security as expected, but the guest list has grown too. Every important man in 3 counties will be there. Crawford? Matthew asked, referring to the territorial representative. Arrived this morning. He's staying at Sullivan's mansion as a guest of honor. Jenkins unpacked the saddlebag he'd brought, revealing its contents on the rough table: a tailored suit for Matthew, an evening gown for Nieli, and various smaller items necessary for their disguises. Nieli approached, running her fingers over the deep blue silk of the dress. Her expression was unreadable. Where did you get this? Widow Hastings runs a dress shop in town, Jenkins explained. Her husband was one of the miners who died in the cave-in 2 years back. Sullivan refused compensation to the families, claimed it was worker error. She's no friend to Sullivan. Matthew examined the suit, black wool, well-cut, the kind a successful businessman might wear. And she asked no questions? Told her it was for a theatrical production in Silver City, Jenkins replied with a hint of his old humor. She seemed to enjoy being part of a deception, though I didn't tell her the true nature of it. Neely held the dress against herself, a strange contrast to her simple buckskin clothing. I have not worn such things, she admitted. Even when I served in Sullivan's house, I wore only servants' clothes. There's more, Jenkins said, reaching into the bag again. Hairpins, gloves, shoes, and these. He produced a small box, opening it to reveal 2 gold wedding bands. You'll go as husband and wife, he explained. Mr. and Mrs. James Westfield, investors from Denver interested in Sullivan's new railroad ventures. Matthew picked up one of the rings, the metal cool against his skin. He had not worn a wedding band since removing his own after Sarah's death, burying it with her as was her wish. The thought of wearing one now, even as a disguise, stirred emotions he had thought long buried. Will it work? He asked, setting the ring down. Sullivan knows everyone with real money in the territory. Westfield is a real investor, Jenkins explained. Sullivan's been courting him for months. The man's never been to Redemption Creek, communicates only by letter. I intercepted a telegram yesterday. Westfield's been delayed in Denver by business, won't make it to the celebration. Sullivan doesn't know that yet. Neely's eyes narrowed with appreciation for the deception. And the real Westfield? Has a reputation for being reclusive, traveling with a young wife he rarely introduces in society. Perfect cover for you both. Matthew nodded slowly. The plan was taking shape, each piece falling into place, yet the risks remained enormous. What about you? He asked Jenkins. Your role? I'll be there in my official capacity, Jenkins replied. Sullivan still thinks I'm his man. I'll create the distraction when needed, get you both out if things go wrong. And if Sullivan realizes you've betrayed him? Jenkins' face hardened. Then I better make sure our plan succeeds, hadn't I? Neely returned to the fire, stoking it higher. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls. Another storm approaching, as if nature itself sensed the confrontation brewing. There's one more thing, Jenkins said, his tone changing. I made inquiries about Doc Miller, the physician who left town after... He hesitated. After your family died. Matthew's attention sharpened. You found him? He's dead, Jenkins said flatly. Supposedly fell from a cliff while hiking in California 3 years ago. Body was never recovered. Another convenient accident, Matthew observed bitterly. Sullivan covers his tracks thoroughly. There's more, Jenkins continued. Before he died, Miller wrote letters, sent one to the Territorial Medical Board alleging misconduct, though he named no names. And he sent another letter to a lawyer in Denver to be opened only upon confirmation of his death. What did it say? Don't know, but the lawyer's name is Peterson. Crawford knows him. They're old friends. If Miller left evidence, then Crawford is the key, Matthew finished. Not just for the Apache massacre, but for Sarah and William too. It's a lot to hang on one meeting, Jenkins cautioned. Crawford may not be willing to move against Sullivan without irrefutable proof. Then we'll give him irrefutable proof, Matthew said, determination hardening his voice. The letter, the ledger, Neely's testimony, and whatever was in Miller's letter to the Denver lawyer. Neely rejoined them, her expression solemn. And if all this fails, if your law still protects the powerful man? Matthew and Jenkins exchanged glances, a silent communication born of their years working together. Then we have a different plan, Jenkins said quietly, one that doesn't rely on laws or courts. Neely understood immediately. Justice of another kind. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, Jenkins said, though his tone suggested he believed it might. Sullivan deserves to face his crimes publicly, to lose everything he's built on blood and lies. He will, Matthew promised, one way or another. They spent the rest of the day reviewing the final details, the mansion's layout, escape routes, contingency plans if they were discovered. Jenkins had drawn a detailed map of Sullivan's home, marking servants' entrances, guard positions, and most importantly, the location of Sullivan's private study where the safe was hidden beneath the floor. As dusk fell, Neely stepped outside to gather more firewood. Matthew joined her, needing air and a moment to clear his head. They worked in companionable silence for a time, the only sounds the snap of branches and the distant call of a hunting owl. The simple task felt strangely intimate, a domestic ritual shared between them as if they had done this many times before. You doubt the plan, Neely observed finally. Matthew paused, a bundle of sticks in his arms. Not the plan itself. Jenkins has thought it through. I doubt that justice will be done, she finished for him. He nodded. I've seen too many guilty men go free. Too many powerful men protected by their money and influence. My father taught that true justice comes not from men's laws, but from the balance of all things, Neely said, gathering fallen pine branches. If Sullivan escapes your courts, he will not escape what is meant to be. You believe that? After what happened to your people? She straightened, meeting his gaze directly. I believe that I have survived for a purpose, that you found me for a purpose, that your sheriff friend has remembered his honor for a purpose. These are not accidents, Shadow Wolf. Matthew studied her face in the fading light. In the few days since he'd found her at the edge of the ravine, she had become more than just an ally against Sullivan. She had become the mirror in which he saw reflections of his former self, the man who once believed in justice, in purpose, in the possibility of making the world better than he found it. You've given me something I didn't expect, he said quietly. What is that? A reason to wake up tomorrow that isn't rooted in hatred. He set down his armful of wood. For 5 years I've been a ghost, haunting the edges of my own life. Then you appeared, and suddenly, you remembered what it was to be alive, she finished, her voice soft but certain. Yes, the admission felt like stepping onto untested ice, dangerous, exhilarating. I'd forgotten what that felt like. Neely moved closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of amber in her dark eyes. My grandmother had a saying, 2 stones struck together create fire. 2 souls wounded by the same blade can create healing. The space between them seemed charged with something Matthew had not felt in years. Possibility. Not romance, not yet, but the recognition that 2 broken paths might someday converge into something whole. What happens after? He asked. If we succeed, if Sullivan faces justice, what then? The question seemed to surprise her. I had not thought beyond justice, she admitted. For 10 years, vengeance has been my only purpose. And when it's fulfilled? She considered this, her face softened by the gathering twilight. My people's land remains. Few of us still live, scattered among other bands. Perhaps a return, a rebuilding. Alone? Her eyes met his, a question in their depths. That would depend. On what? On whether a former sheriff might find purpose in helping rebuild what was broken, she replied, her voice steady, but something vulnerable in her eyes. on whether there is room in his heart for more than just the ghosts of his past. The moment stretched between them, fragile and precious. Matthew found himself reaching for her hand, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. For an instant, they stood connected, not just by their common enemy, but by the tentative hope of what might come after. Before he could respond, a low whistle came from the cabin, Jenkins' signal that someone was approaching. They dropped the firewood, moving swiftly and silently back to the shelter of the trees. But the unspoken possibility remained. A warmth carried between them even as danger approached once more. A lone rider approached from the direction of town, moving at a steady trot along the seldom-used trail. As the figure drew closer, Matthew recognized the silhouette, Sam Wilson, owner of the Wayfarer Saloon and his old friend. Jenkins emerged from the cabin, hand on his revolver. "Sam, that you?" Wilson reined in his horse, peering through the gathering darkness. "Jenkins? What in hell? I've been riding in circles for an hour trying to find this place." "What are you doing here?" Jenkins demanded. "Looking for you." Wilson dismounted stiffly, showing his age. "You didn't show up for your evening rounds. People are asking questions." Jenkins relaxed slightly. "I'm on Sullivan's business, tracking outlaws." "That's horseshit and you know it," Wilson said bluntly. "Word's out that Matthew Cole's been seen in the territory. Sullivan's offering $5,000 for information leading to his capture." He paused, scanning the shadows. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Matthew stepped forward, letting Wilson see him clearly for the first time. "Hello, Sam." Wilson's weathered face registered shock, then a slow smile spread across his features. "Well, I'll be damned. The prodigal returns." He glanced at Jenkins. "And an interesting company." "It's not what you think, Sam," Jenkins began. "Isn't it?" Wilson interrupted. "Because it looks like you've switched sides in a war Sullivan doesn't even know he's fighting yet." His gaze shifted back to Matthew. "You look like hell, Matt." "Been a rough week," Matthew replied dryly. Wilson's eyes darted to the trees where Nayeli remained hidden. "And the Apache woman?" "Sullivan's men have been tearing the mountains apart looking for her." Matthew tensed, hand dropping to his side where Harker's revolver now rested. "What do you know about that?" "Enough to be here instead of in Sullivan's office collecting a reward," Wilson said pointedly. Jenkins stepped forward, placing himself between the two men. "Why are you here, Sam? Really?" Wilson sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 60-odd years. "Because I've spent too long watching Sullivan destroy everything decent in Redemption Creek. Because I let him drive out my best friend 5 years ago. Because I'm tired of living with the taste of cowardice in my mouth every morning." He faced Matthew directly. "And because Shiro and William deserve better than what happened to them." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. Matthew felt the tension ease from his shoulders. "You're taking a big risk coming here." "Not as big as whatever you three are planning," Wilson countered. "Which brings me to why I really came. Sullivan knows." The words landed like stones in still water, ripples of alarm spreading outward. "Knows what?" Jenkins demanded. "That Matthew's back. That he's not alone. That whatever's happening has something to do with the Apache woman." Wilson removed his hat, running a hand through thinning hair. "He's called in more guns. Professional killers from Denver. Not just the usual local muscle. Whatever you're planning for Founders on, he's ready." Jenkins cursed softly. "How did he find out?" "One of his hunting parties found the bodies near the line shack," Wilson explained. "Found evidence 2 people had been there recently. Put it together with reports of a wounded man matching Matthew's description." "What about Nayeli?" Matthew asked. "Does he know she's still alive?" "He suspects, but isn't certain." Wilson's gaze shifted to the trees again. "He's not taking chances, though. Every Apache within 50 miles is being rounded up, questioned." Nayeli emerged from the shadows then, her face a mask of controlled anger. "More innocents suffering for Sullivan's crimes." Wilson stared at her, momentarily startled by her sudden appearance and regal bearing. "Ma'am," he managed with an awkward tip of his hat. "This changes things," Jenkins said grimly. "If Sullivan's suspicious, security will be even tighter tomorrow night." "We abort," Matthew said firmly. "Find another way." "There is no other way," Nayeli countered. "Crawford leaves the day after tomorrow. The celebration is our only chance to reach him with the evidence." "She's right," Jenkins agreed reluctantly. "We won't get another opportunity like this." "It's too dangerous now," Matthew insisted. "Sullivan will be watching for us." He'll be watching for a wounded ex-sheriff and an Apache woman, Wilson interjected, not a wealthy investor, and his wife from Denver. He glanced at the clothes laid out on the table inside the cabin. That's your plan, isn't it? Infiltrate the celebration in disguise? Jenkins nodded. Crawford's our target. If we can get him the evidence of Sullivan's crimes, it might work, Wilson said slowly, but you'll need help. Another set of eyes inside, someone who can warn you if things go wrong. You're volunteering, Matthew asked, surprised. I told you, I'm tired of living with cowardice. Wilson squared his shoulders. Besides, Sullivan always invites me to these things. Likes to remind the town that even the independent businesses are welcome under his protection. The four of them moved inside the cabin, where Jenkins quickly brought Wilson up to speed on the details of their plan. The saloon owner listened attentively, occasionally offering suggestions based on his knowledge of Sullivan's mansion and security arrangements. The timing is crucial, Jenkins emphasized. The celebration begins at 7. Crawford will make a speech around 8, after which Sullivan traditionally leads the important guests on a tour of the new mining facilities. That's when his study will be empty. Except for guards, Matthew pointed out. I can handle that, Jenkins assured him. As sheriff, I can order Sullivan's men to different positions, claim there has been a security concern elsewhere. And I'll create a distraction if needed, Wilson added. Nothing draws attention like a drunk falling into the punch bowl. Despite the gravity of their situation, Matthew felt a smile tug at his lips. It reminded him of the old days, planning operations with Jenkins, Wilson providing information from his saloon where miners and cowboys alike loosened their tongues with whiskey. It might actually work, he admitted. It has to, Neely said softly, for all who have died at Sullivan's hands. There's one more thing, Wilson said, his expression turning somber. Sullivan's planning an announcement tomorrow night. Word is he's secured federal approval for expansion into the Northern Territories. Apache land, Nellie said, her voice tight. Wilson nodded. What's left of it? Crawford's supposedly bringing the signed documents with him. Then our time frame is even shorter than we thought, Jenkins observed. Once those papers are signed and filed, it will be much harder to reverse Sullivan's claims, even with proof of his crimes. So we get to Crawford before the signing, Matthew said. Show him the evidence, convince him to hold off. And if he doesn't, Neely asked, if he is as corrupt as Sullivan? Then we move to Plan B, Matthew said grimly. We take the evidence directly to the territorial governor in Denver, by force if necessary. The cabin fell silent as each contemplated the enormity of what they were planning, not just exposing one man's crimes, but potentially altering the future of the entire territory, changing the course of what many saw as inevitable Western expansion. Get some rest, Jenkins finally said. Tomorrow will test us all. Wilson departed shortly after, returning to town before his absence could be noted. The remaining three settled into an uneasy vigilance, taking turns on watch throughout the night. Matthew took the first shift, sitting just outside the cabin door where he could observe the approach trail. The night was clear, stars piercing the black canopy overhead with cold fire. He found his thoughts turning to Sarah, to the life they had built and lost in Redemption Creek. She had supported his stance against Sullivan, even knowing the risks. Some things are worth standing for, she had told him the night he'd been stripped of his badge. Some truths must be spoken, whatever the cost. The cost had been higher than either of them could have imagined. I'm finishing what we started, he whispered to the stars. I'm bringing him down, Sarah. For you, for William, for all of us. The wind carried his words away, but somehow he felt she had heard them. For the first time in 5 years, the memory of her face brought not just pain, but resolve. Tomorrow, everything would change, one way or another. The storm that had threatened for days finally broke at dawn, rain lashing the cabin roof in torrential sheets. It was still falling steadily by late afternoon as they made final preparations, the weather matching the tension that filled the small space. Nellie stood before a cracked mirror Jenkins had brought, barely recognizing the woman who stared back. The blue silk dress fit her slender frame perfectly, the high collar and long sleeves hiding most of her sun-darkened skin. Jenkins had brought cosmetics as well, powder to lighten her complexion, rouge for her cheeks, paint for her lips. Her transformation was startling. With her hair arranged in the latest Denver fashion and her features softened by careful application of the cosmetics, She looked nothing like the fierce Apache woman who had survived a decade of hiding. She looked like a society wife, delicate and refined. "Will it be enough?" she asked, turning to where Matthew was adjusting his own disguise. His change was equally dramatic. Clean-shaven now, his hair trimmed and pomaded in the style of a successful businessman, the tailored suit lending him an air of prosperity and confidence. The past 5 years of hardship seemed to have fallen away, revealing the commanding presence that had once made him an effective lawman. "It'll be enough to get us through the door," he assured him. "After that, it's down to luck and timing." Jenkins entered, bringing a final load of supplies, a small derringer for Nayeli to hide in her reticule, ammunition for Matthew's revolver, and a folded sheet of paper. "What's this?" Matthew asked, taking the paper. "Guest list," Jenkins replied, "and a rough schedule for the evening. Sam sent it over with his boy." Matthew scanned the document, committing the names to memory. "Crawford's seated at Sullivan's table for dinner." "As expected," Jenkins nodded. "He'll be surrounded by Sullivan's men until the speech. That's our first opportunity to approach him." "In the safe?" Neely asked. "Study will be locked during dinner," Jenkins explained, "but Sullivan traditionally gives Crawford a private meeting before the main announcements. That's when the study will be empty, the safe accessible." "Assuming Sullivan doesn't carry the ledger with him," Matthew pointed out. "He won't," Neely said confidently. "The ledger is too incriminating, too valuable to risk carrying. It stays in the safe except when he updates it." Matthew checked his pocket watch, a final touch to his disguise provided by Wilson. "Almost 6. We should move soon if we want to arrive fashionably late." The rain had slackened to a steady drizzle by the time they set out, Jenkins riding ahead to maintain the appearance of normalcy in town, while Matthew and Neely followed in a rented buggy Wilson had left for them half a mile down the trail. The mud-slicked road wound down from the foothills toward Redemption Creek, the town's lights beginning to twinkle through the gray curtain of rain. Sullivan's mansion stood on the highest point, windows blazing with lamplight, carriages already gathering in the circular drive before it. As they approached the outskirts of town, Matthew felt Neely tense beside him. "Second thoughts?" he asked quietly. "No," she replied, "but it has been many years since I walked openly among the white man's dwellings, and never as one of them." "You're not one of them," he reminded her. "You're playing a role, as am I. And if we are discovered," Matthew's hand moved to the revolver concealed beneath his jacket, "then we fight our way out, or die trying." She nodded, satisfied with this answer. "Either way, Sullivan's crimes will be exposed. If not to your courts, then to the final judgment that awaits all men." The rain intensified as they reached the town proper, forcing them to delay slightly as they navigated the muddy streets. By the time they turned onto the hill leading to Sullivan's mansion, it was nearing 7:30. The celebration would be in full swing. Guards stood at the entrance to the estate, checking invitations against a list. Matthew presented the forged invitation Jenkins had prepared, adopting the slight impatience of a man of means inconvenienced by the weather and security. "James Westfield and wife," he announced, allowing a hint of Denver's more refined accent to color his speech. "We were delayed by the storm." The guard checked the list, nodded, and waved them through. The first hurdle cleared. As their buggy joined the line approaching the mansion's entrance, Matthew glanced at Neely. "Ready, Mrs. Westfield?" She met his gaze, her eyes, the one feature no disguise could fully alter, burning with the accumulated purpose of 10 years. "I have waited a decade for this night," she said softly. "I am ready for whatever comes." The buggy stopped at the grand entrance where liveried footmen waited with umbrellas to escort guests inside. As Matthew helped Nayeli down, her hands small but strong in his, the mansion loomed before them, a temple to Sullivan's wealth and power, built on the blood of innocence. Tonight they would bring it crashing down. Sullivan's mansion stood as a monument to wealth extracted from the earth and the blood of those who worked it. From the outside, it resembled an Eastern aristocrat's manor transplanted to the frontier. 3 stories of imposing stonework, wide verandas, and tall windows blazing with light. Inside, it was even more ostentatious, with imported marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and furnishings that had traveled thousands of miles by rail and wagon to reach this remote corner of Colorado. Matthew and Nayeli stepped into the grand foyer, where a liveried servant took their wet coats. Around them swirled Redemption Creek's elite, mine owners, merchants, bankers, and politicians, all orbiting the center of power and wealth that Robert Sullivan had created. Mr. and Mrs. James Westfield, announced the doorman, consulting their invitation. A few curious glances turned their way. Newcomers were always objects of interest in frontier society, but no recognition flickered in any face. Matthew allowed himself a small breath of relief. The disguises were working, at least for now. Remember, he murmured to Nellie as he offered his arm, you're a society wife from Denver. Quiet, demure, impressed by Sullivan's achievements. She placed her gloved hand on his arm, her expression perfectly composed. I have played many roles to survive, Shadow Wolf, she replied softly. This is merely one more. They moved into this main ballroom, a cavernous space dominated by a grand staircase at one end and long tables laden with food at the other. A string quartet played in one corner, the music nearly drowned by the hum of conversation and laughter. Matthew scanned the room, cataloging faces and positions with the practiced eye of a lawman. Jenkins stood near the main entrance in his official capacity, seemingly engaged in conversation with the mayor, but watching the room carefully. Sam Wilson was at the punch bowl, playing his role as the slightly inebriated town businessman to perfection. And there, at the center of a circle of admirers, stood Robert Sullivan. At 53, Sullivan remained an imposing figure. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver threading his dark hair and a meticulously groomed beard, he exuded the confidence of a man accustomed to bending the world to his will. He laughed at something one of his companions said, the sound booming across the room. Every gesture, every expression, radiated power and absolute certainty in his own righteousness. Beside him stood a younger man, perhaps 40, with the polished manner and expensive tailoring of an Eastern politician. Crawford, the territorial representative, Matthew surmised. The man who held the key to their success or failure this night. Nieli's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on Matthew's arm as her gaze fell on Sullivan. It was the only outward sign of the storm that must be raging within her, facing the architect of her people's destruction, the man who had ordered the deaths of her family and tribe. Not yet, Matthew cautioned under his breath. Dinner first, then we move. She gave an almost imperceptible nod, composing her features once more into the pleasant mask of Mrs. Westfield, wealthy investor's wife. They circulated through the crowd, Matthew introducing himself as James Westfield to various guests, speaking knowledgeably about mining investments and railroad expansion, subjects he had discussed extensively with Jenkins and Wilson during their preparation. Nieli remained largely silent beside him, smiling politely, playing her role with remarkable skill. No one challenged them. No one looked too closely at the supposedly wealthy investor from Denver and his beautiful exotic wife. They saw what they expected to see, just as Nieli had predicted. A bell chimed, signaling dinner. Servants directed guests toward the dining room, where a massive table had been set for 50. Matthew noted with satisfaction that they had been seated far from Sullivan and Crawford. Jenkins' work, no doubt, ensuring they wouldn't face close scrutiny during the meal. As they took their places, Matthew caught Jenkins' eye across the room. The sheriff gave a slight nod. All was proceeding according to plan. Dinner passed in a blur of courses and forced conversation with their table companions, a banker and his wife, a mining engineer, the town's newspaper editor. Matthew maintained his persona with practiced ease, drawing on memories of wealthy visitors he'd encountered during his time as sheriff. Nieli remained mostly silent, as befitted a society wife of the era, but when she did speak, she revealed an uncanny ability to mimic the speech patterns and mannerisms of wealthy white women. Matthew wondered how many hours she had spent observing Sullivan's household from within, learning the ways of her enemies in preparation for this moment. Throughout the meal, he kept Sullivan in his peripheral vision. The mining baron held court at the head of the table, Crawford seated at his right hand like a favored son. They conversed animatedly, pausing occasionally to address other guests or to signal servants for more wine. As dessert was being served, Jenkins made his way casually around the perimeter of the room, stopping briefly behind Matthew's chair. Crawford and Sullivan will retire to the study immediately after dinner, he murmured, adjusting Matthew's chair as if being helpful. Private meeting before the speech. That's our window. Matthew nodded slightly. Guards? 2 at the study door. I'll handle them. Jenkins moved on, maintaining the appearance of a vigilant sheriff overseeing security. When dinner concluded, Sullivan rose, tapping his glass for attention. Esteemed guests, we will reconvene in the ballroom in 30 minutes for the official portion of our celebration. Until then, please enjoy the grounds and refreshments. He gestured to Crawford, and the two men exited through a side door, accompanied by two suited men who moved with the unmistakable vigilance of professional guards. The moment had arrived. Matthew caught Neely's eye, then Sam Wilson's. The saloon keeper nodded almost imperceptibly, then proceeded to become noticeably more intoxicated, his voice rising as he engaged the banker in an increasingly animated discussion about the price of silver. "Shall we step outside for air, my dear?" Matthew suggested loudly enough to be heard by their dinner companions. "The rain appears to have stopped." "Of course, James," Neely replied, her voice perfectly modulated to convey the deference expected from a wife of her supposed station. They exited the dining room, not toward the gardens where most guests were heading, but down a side corridor that Jenkins had identified on his map as leading towards Sullivan's private wing. The passage was dimly lit and thankfully deserted, the servants busy attending to guests in the main areas. "The study is at the end of this hallway, then left," Matthew whispered. "Jenkins should have the guards cleared by now." They moved swiftly but unhurriedly, maintaining the bearing of guests taking an innocent stroll should they encounter anyone. The corridor ended at a junction. They turned left as planned. Ahead stood a heavy oak door, Sullivan's study. The guards who should have been posted there were conspicuously absent. "Jenkins came through," Matthew observed, relief evident in his voice. They approached the door cautiously. From within came the murmur of voices, Sullivan and Crawford, deep in private conversation. Matthew pressed his ear against the dark wood, straining to hear. "The documents are in order," Crawford was saying. "Once announced, the land transfer will be official. The Apache claims become moot." "Excellent," Sullivan's voice replied, satisfaction evident. "And the governor understands the, arrangement?" 20% of all new mining revenue, Crawford confirmed, channeled through the appropriate shell companies, of course. Neely's eyes flashed with anger at this casual discussion of the theft of her people's land, but she maintained her composure. The evidence they sought would put an end to these corrupt dealings, if they could obtain it. "Now we wait," Matthew whispered. "When they leave for the speech, we'll have minutes at most to find the ledger." They retreated to an alcove containing a decorative suit of armor, where they could observe the study door while remaining hidden from casual view. Minutes stretched like hours as they waited, tension building with each passing moment. Finally, the study door opened. Sullivan emerged first, followed by Crawford. Both men looked pleased, like hunters returning from a successful expedition. "It's a new era for the territory," Sullivan was saying. "No more primitive hindrances to progress." Crawford nodded his agreement as they moved down the corridor toward the ballroom, their guards falling in behind them. Neither man glanced toward the alcove where Matthew and Neely waited in shadow. The moment the corridor cleared, they moved. Matthew reached the study door first, testing the handle. Locked as expected. Neely produced the brass key from her reticule. "This opens all doors in Sullivan's private wing," she whispered. "I saw him use it many times." The key slid into the lock, turned with a soft click. They slipped inside, closing the door silently behind them. Sullivan's study was a testament to his self-image. Massive mahogany desk, walls lined with leather-bound books he likely never read, mounted animal heads from hunting expeditions, and a large portrait of himself hanging above a marble fireplace. The trappings of civilization laid over a predator's den. "The safe is beneath the desk," Neely said, moving quickly to the imposing piece of furniture. "Hidden under a panel in the floor." Matthew stood guard at the door, listening for approaching footsteps, while Neely knelt and located the hidden panel. It slid aside smoothly, revealing a small iron safe embedded in the floor. "The key," she prompted, and Matthew passed her the brass key they had taken from Sullivan's house years ago. She inserted it into the safe's lock, then hesitated. "The combination." "Jenkins said Sullivan keeps it in a notebook in his breast pocket," Matthew reminded her. "We need another way." Nellie studied the dial intently. "I saw him open it once, not the numbers, but the motions." She closed her eyes, visualizing. Right, then left, then right again. She began to turn the dial, moving slowly, listening for the subtle click of tumblers falling into place. Her fingers were steady, her concentration absolute. A hunter stalking the most important prey of her life. A faint click. She continued turning, reversing direction as the mechanism required. Another click, fainter than the first. "Hurry," Matthew urged, acutely aware of the passing minutes. Sullivan's speech would begin soon, and their absence from the ballroom would eventually be noted. "Almost," Neely whispered, making the final turn with exquisite precision. A third click, and the safe door swung open. Inside lay several documents, a small leather pouch that clinked with the sound of gold coins, and what they sought, a thick ledger bound in red leather, the edges of its pages worn from frequent handling. Naeli removed it reverently, as if handling a sacred object. In a way, it was the record of Sullivan's crimes, the key to justice long denied. Matthew joined her, taking the ledger and quickly rifling through its pages. What they found exceeded their expectations. Sullivan had recorded everything: bribes paid, officials compromised, competitors eliminated. And there, in neat handwriting dated 10 years earlier, details of the Apache problem resolution, the massacre of the White Mountain tribe, the men hired to carry it out, the total cost in dollars and cents for the murder of an entire people. "This is it," Matthew breathed. "Everything we need." He turned more pages, searching for a specific date, the week Sarah and William had died. His finger stopped on an entry that caused his blood to freeze. "Problem elimination, Cole family, 500 to earn for special compound. Untraceable, simulates fever symptoms. Sheriff problem resolved permanently." The confirmation of his worst fears, written in Sullivan's own hand. Not fever that had claimed his family, but poison administered by someone paid by Sullivan. M. Miller, the town doctor who had later fled, then died mysteriously himself. Rage rose in Matthew's throat, threatening to choke him. He had suspected, had told himself for years that Sullivan was responsible, but seeing it written so coldly, so clinically. "Matthew," Nellie's voice cut through his fury, her hand on his arm. "We must go, now." He forced himself back to the present. Yes, the evidence, justice, that was what mattered now. They closed the safe, replaced the floor panel, and moved to the door. Matthew pressed his ear against it, listening for movement in the corridor. Hearing nothing, he eased it open a crack, peering out. The hallway was empty. They slipped out, Nieli locking the door behind them. The ledger was secured inside Matthew's jacket, pressed against his side where the bullet wound still ached. A reminder of how much they had sacrificed to reach this point. They had just turned toward the main corridor when a voice stopped them cold. "Mr. and Mrs. Westfield, I believe? Or should I say, former Sheriff Cole and, well, I don't believe I know the lady's name." Sullivan stood at the junction of the corridors, flanked by two armed men. His smile was cold, predatory, utterly confident. Behind him stood Jenkins, a gun pressed to his back by a third guard. "I must commend you on your disguises," Sullivan continued conversationally. "Quite convincing, but you see, the real James Westfield arrived an hour ago. Imagine my surprise when my staff reported two Mr. Westfields at my celebration." Matthew's hand moved toward his concealed revolver, but Sullivan's guards raised their weapons in warning. "I wouldn't," Sullivan advised. "Not if you want the good sheriff here to see another sunrise." Jenkins' face was bloodied, one eye swollen shut. He had fought, and fought hard, before being captured. "How did you know?" Matthew asked, playing for time, mind racing through options. "I've been expecting something like this since my men failed to return from their hunting expedition," Sullivan replied. "Though I admit I didn't anticipate you'd make it all the way into my study." His gaze shifted to Nellie, narrowing with sudden recognition. "Ah, I see now. Black Elk's daughter. I thought we'd eliminated all of his line." Neely's chin lifted, pride displacing fear. "You failed, as you fail in all things of true importance." Sullivan laughed, genuinely amused. "Spirit. I admire that, even in a savage. It's a pity you chose this path. You might have lived out your days in anonymity." "As you will not live out yours in immunity," she replied coldly. Sullivan's amusement faded. "You've taken something from my study," he stated. "I want it back." "Don't know what you're talking about," Matthew said flatly. Search them, Sullivan ordered. One guard moved forward, roughly patting down Matthew's jacket. He found the ledger immediately, pulling it free with a triumphant grunt. Ah, there it is. Sullivan took the book, flipping through it briefly. My private records. How rude of you to peek. He tucked it into his own jacket. Now the question becomes what to do with you. A public trial would be inconvenient. Too many questions. People know we're here, Matthew bluffed. Wilson, Crawford. Sam Wilson is currently unconscious in my wine cellar, Sullivan interrupted smoothly. As for Crawford, he's about to announce the official transfer of all remaining Apache territories to territorial development. He has no interest in your accusations. He gestured to his men. Take them to the old mine shaft. Make it look like an accident. Trespassers who fell exploring where they shouldn't. No connection to tonight's events. The guards moved forward, weapons trained on Matthew and Nieli. One grabbed Nieli's arm roughly. She did not resist, her eyes fixed on Sullivan with burning intensity. You murdered my family, Matthew said, his voice deadly quiet. My wife, my 8-year-old son. Poison, not fever. Something flickered in Sullivan's eyes. Not remorse, but annoyance at being confronted with this particular crime. Necessary business decisions, Cole, nothing personal. You are becoming problematic. I'm about to become a lot more than problematic, Matthew promised. Sullivan sighed with exaggerated patience. Empty threats from a dead man, how tedious. Take them. A gunshot echoed through the corridor. One of Sullivan's guards jerked, then collapsed, blood blooming across his chest. Sullivan and the remaining guards spun toward the sound. Sam Wilson stood at the far end of the corridor, a smoking shotgun in his hands. Sorry I'm late to the party, he called, his voice surprisingly steady for a man supposedly unconscious in a wine cellar. Had to convince some fellows I was drunker than I looked. The momentary distraction was all Matthew needed. He lunged forward, tackling the guard nearest to him. They crashed to the floor, struggling for control of the man's revolver. Nieli moved simultaneously, driving her knee into her captor's groin with ruthless precision. As he doubled over, she wrenched his gun arm upward, forcing him to fire into the ceiling rather than at Wilson. Jenkins, despite his injuries, used the chaos to slam his head backward into his guard's face. Bone crunched as the man's nose shattered. His grip loosened enough for Jenkins to break free. Sullivan backed away from the melee, reaching inside his jacket, not for the ledger, but for a small derringer. He raised it, aiming not at Matthew or Jenkins, but at Nieli, who had just gained control of her guard's weapon. No, Matthew shouted, seeing Sullivan's intention. He drove his elbow into his opponent's throat, broke free, and hurled himself towards Sullivan. The derringer fired with a sharp crack. Matthew felt the bullet graze his shoulder as he crashed into Sullivan, driving them both against the wall. The impact knocked the breath from Sullivan's lungs and sent the derringer skittering across the floor. Matthew pinned the older man, his forearm pressed against Sullivan's throat. It's over, he growled. The ledger, the letter, Nieli's testimony, it all comes out now. You think anyone will believe you? Sullivan gasped, struggling for breath. I own this town, this territory. Not anymore, Crawford's voice came from behind them. Matthew turned, maintaining his grip on Sullivan, to see the territorial representatives standing at the junction of the corridors, flanked by several men who were definitely not Sullivan's guards. Federal marshals by the look of their badges. What is the meaning of this, Crawford? Sullivan demanded, his face purpling from Matthew's pressure on his throat. Crawford stepped forward, his expression grim. Robert Sullivan, you're under arrest for corruption, bribery of federal officials, and conspiracy to commit murder. He gestured to the marshals. Take him. Matthew released Sullivan, stepping back as the marshals moved in to secure him. He looked to Nieli, who stood with her captured revolver still trained on the guards she'd subdued. She was unharmed. Sullivan's bullet had missed. How? Matthew began, looking at Crawford in confusion. Sheriff Jenkins approached me 2 days ago, Crawford explained. Caught me alone after Sullivan retired for the night. He told me a disturbing story about massacres and cover-ups. You believed him just like that? Matthew asked skeptically. A man wearing Sullivan's badge? Crawford's face hardened. Sullivan murdered my brother-in-law 3 years ago, a federal mining inspector who was getting too close to his operations. Official cause of death, mining accident. We both know how Sullivan handles his problems. He glanced at Jenkins. And I've known Tom since we were boys in Denver. I know when he's telling the truth. You knew about Miller's letter? Jenkins asked, wiping blood from his face. Crawford nodded. Miller wasn't just your town doctor. He was an informant for the federal government, investigating suspicious deaths in mining communities. Before his accident, he sent evidence to my office, including allegations about the deaths of your family, Cole. That's why Sullivan had him killed, Matthew realized, the pieces falling into place. Exactly. I've been building a case against Sullivan for years, not months. His corruption extends far beyond Redemption Creek into federal contracts worth millions. But the physical proof always disappeared before we could move. Crawford gestured to Sullivan's men. He's thorough about tying up loose ends. The ledger, Matthew remembered suddenly. He turned to where Sullivan was being handcuffed. In his jacket, a marshal extracted the red leather book from Sullivan's inner pocket, handing it to Crawford. The representative opened it, his expression darkening as he scanned the entries. This is comprehensive, he observed. Sullivan appears to have documented every crime he's committed for the past 15 years, including, and he looked up at Matthew, the murder of your family. Sullivan's composure finally cracked. That book is my private property. This is theft, an illegal search. Actually, Crawford replied, it's evidence seized during the arrest of a federal suspect. Perfectly admissible in court. He turned to Matthew. When Jenkins told me about your plan and the ledger you believed existed, I saw our chance. I kept playing Sullivan's friend while positioning federal marshals as extra security for the event. You used us as bait, Jenkins realized. Crawford had the grace to look slightly abashed. I knew Sullivan would be suspicious of you both. That's why I insisted on bringing my own security team, actually federal marshals, and station them throughout the mansion. We've been watching Sullivan's every move since I arrived. But those land transfers we overheard, Neely said, her eyes narrowing. You were agreeing to steal Apache land. A performance, Crawford replied firmly. Sullivan needed to believe I was still his ally. Those documents are worthless. I never intended to file them. My real purpose was getting close enough to catch him red-handed. Matthew studied Crawford carefully. You risked our lives for your case. I took a calculated risk, Crawford admitted, and I made sure you were never truly in danger. My men were watching this corridor the entire time. If Sullivan had moved against you sooner, they would have intervened immediately. The territorial representative's cool calculation reminded Matthew uncomfortably of Sullivan himself. A different kind of predator, perhaps, but a predator nonetheless. What happens now, he asked. Sullivan will be transported to Denver for trial, Crawford replied. Federal charges. They carry the death penalty. The evidence in this ledger, combined with your testimonies, should be more than sufficient for conviction. He turned to Nellie. You would be a particularly valuable witness, Miss Nellie, she supplied, daughters of Chief Black Elk of the White Mountain Apache. Recognition flickered in Crawford's eyes. I see. Then you can testify to the massacre Sullivan orchestrated. I can. I will. Crawford nodded, satisfied. As for the territorial expansion Sullivan was planning to announce tonight, in light of these revelations, those plans will be reconsidered. The Apache lands will remain protected under the existing treaties. It was as close to justice as they could have hoped for. Sullivan facing trial, his crimes exposed, the land grab prevented. Yet Matthew felt strangely hollow as he watched the marshals lead Sullivan away. The man responsible for Sarah and William's deaths would pay, but it would not bring them back. You did it, Matt, Sam Wilson said, approaching with his shotgun now lowered. You brought him down. We all did, Matthew corrected, looking from Wilson to Jenkins to Nellie. Each had risked everything for this moment. Outside the mansion, raised voices indicated the celebration had devolved into confusion as news of Sullivan's arrest spread. The empire he had built was already beginning to crumble. Crawford approached Matthew once more. The territory owes you a debt, Cole. If you're interested, the position of federal marshal for this region is open. We need men of integrity to help rebuild what Sullivan corrupted. The offer was unexpected. 5 years ago, it would have been everything Matthew wanted. A badge with real authority. A chance to enforce justice beyond the limits of a town sheriff. Now he wasn't sure. He looked to Nieli, who stood straight and proud despite the evening's ordeal. "What will you do?" he asked her. "Return to what remains of my people," she answered. "Begin rebuilding. The mountains have always been our home." Matthew nodded, understanding. Her quest for justice had defined her life for 10 years. Now, like him, she faced the question of what came after vengeance. "Crawford," he said, turning back to the representative, "that marshal's position, would its jurisdiction include the Northern Territories, the Apache lands?" "It would," Crawford confirmed, a knowing look in his eyes. "Someone needs to ensure the treaties are respected this time." Matthew considered this, a new purpose, a way to protect those who had been vulnerable to men like Sullivan, perhaps even a chance to rebuild something of his own life from the ashes of the past. "I'll think about it," he said finally. As they left Sullivan's mansion, the rain had stopped completely. The storm clouds had broken, revealing a sky bright with stars, the same stars that had watched over the mountains long before men came seeking silver, the same stars that would remain long after their brief conflicts were settled. Justice had been served, after a fashion. Not perfect justice, such a thing rarely existed in an imperfect world. But enough. Sullivan would face trial for his crimes. The Apache lands would remain protected, and those who had survived to see this day would have a chance to build something new from the wreckage of the past. Matthew stood alone on the mansion's veranda, staring out at the town below. The ledger lay open in his hands, his fingers tracing the cold, precise handwriting that had documented his family's murder as nothing more than a business expense. $500, the price Sullivan had placed on Sarah and William's lives. "Does it bring peace?" Neely's voice came softly from behind him. "Knowing the truth at last?" Matthew closed the ledger. "Not peace," he said after a long moment, "but something else, something I'd forgotten." "What?" "Purpose." He turned to face her, his weathered face showing emotion he'd kept buried for 5 years. "Sarah used to tell me that finding the truth mattered more than anything, that without truth there can be no justice." His voice thickened. "She would have been proud today." Nellie stepped closer, her hand touching his arm, a gesture that would have been unthinkable days before. "Your wife was wise. My father taught that truth is like water. It always finds its path, no matter how the mountains try to block it." Their eyes met, acknowledging without words the shared pain that had brought them together, and something new growing from that scorched earth. "What will you do now?" he asked, though something in his eyes suggested he already knew the answer. "Rebuild," she said simply. "The White Mountain people need to come home. There are children among us who have never known our sacred lands except through stories." Matthew nodded. "It won't be easy. There will be men like Sullivan who see only silver in the mountains, not spirits." "Then they will need to be taught differently," she replied, a hint of her father's authority in her voice. "By someone who understands both worlds." The implication hung between them, unspoken but clear. 6 months later, a different kind of gathering took place on the hills where the White Mountain Apache had once made their summer camp. Tents and newly built cabins dotted the landscape, smoke rising from cooking fires where families are prepared the evening meal. Federal Marshal Matthew Cole dismounted from his horse at the edge of the encampment. He no longer resembled the grief-haunted recluse who had hidden from the world. The badge on his chest caught the late afternoon sun, a symbol not of authority alone, but of protection. Children ran past, laughing, one stopping briefly to touch the star with curious fingers before darting away. Matthew smiled, a gesture that once felt foreign to his face but now came more naturally. Neely emerged from the largest cabin, dressed in a blend of traditional Apache garments and practical frontier wear. As leader of her people's return, she had adopted an approach that honored tradition while acknowledging the changing world around them. "Marshal," she greeted him formally, though her eyes held warmth that belied the title. "Chief," he replied with equal formality, though the corner of his mouth quirked upward. They walked together through the camp, speaking of boundaries and treaties, of mining claims and water rights. The work of justice continued, daily and unglamorous, but necessary. As sunset painted the mountains in gold and crimson, they stood together on a ridge overlooking both the Apache encampment and, in the distance, the lights of Redemption Creek, now renamed New Horizon by its residents after Sullivan's fall. "Crawford sent word," Matthew said. "Sullivan's hanging is set for next month in Denver." Nayeli nodded, her expression solemn. Will you go? No, he said after a moment. I've seen enough death. I'd rather be here building something. She turned to him then, studying his face. The elders have been asking when you will stop riding away each night. They say a marshal who protects the people should live among them. Matthew met her gaze steadily. And what do you say? I say that paths that converge in blood and fire can also join in peace, she replied. If that is what is chosen. He reached for her hand, a gesture bridging two worlds, two lives once broken by the same enemy, now healing in tandem. I choose it, he said simply. Against the backdrop of mountains that had witnessed both massacres and rebirth, Matthew Cole and Nayeli stood together, the former sheriff and the chief's daughter, united by a justice hard-won and a future now shared under the same ancient stars that had guided them home. But for the first time in 5 years, Matthew looked to the future with something that felt dangerously like hope, and this time he embraced it without fear.